I walked across the graduation stage to the sound of polite applause from strangers, looking out at 5 empty seats reserved for my husband, my 2 children, and my parents. They had all skipped my master degree ceremony to attend my brother Derek's backyard barbecue. But the real nightmare began when I stepped off the stage and saw 63 missed calls from my husband, followed by a single text message reading, "We need to talk urgently. Get to Memorial Hospital now." My name is Olivia. I am 33 years old, and before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I did not even take off my navy blue graduation gown. I sprinted to my car and broke every speed limit driving across Seattle. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. 63 missed calls. In my mind, I saw the absolute worst-case scenarios: a fatal car crash, a drowning, a terrifying home invasion. Every horrible thought imaginable raced through my mind as I gripped the steering wheel, praying that I would not be too late. I abandoned my car in the emergency room, drop-off zone, my graduation cap falling onto the floorboards as I threw the door open. I burst through the automatic sliding doors of Memorial Hospital, my academic robes billowing behind me, gasping for breath. The receptionist pointed me toward Bay 7. I ran down the sterile white hallway, mentally preparing myself for the sight of blood, for the sound of flatlining heart monitors, for a reality I was not ready to face. I yanked the privacy curtain back, my voice trembling as I called out for my husband David. But the scene in front of me made me freeze in my tracks. There was no blood. There were no life support machines. Instead, the small hospital room smelled strongly of chlorine and grilled hot dogs. My 14-year-old son Ethan was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed wearing his damp swimming trunks. His right arm was secured in a temporary splint. He was casually scrolling through his phone with his left hand. Sitting around the bed were my husband David, my 11-year-old daughter Mia, my father William, my mother Catherine, and my older brother Derek. Every single one of them was dressed in expensive resort wear, still damp from Derek's new luxury pool. Nobody looked traumatized. Nobody looked like they had just narrowly escaped death. They looked mildly inconvenienced. It was as if they had simply paused their Sunday afternoon party to deal with a minor annoyance. The sheer lack of urgency in the room was entirely disconnected from the sheer panic I had felt during my entire drive. Before I could even catch my breath to ask what happened, my mother, Catherine, stepped forward, her face contorted with that familiar look of absolute disdain she had perfected over the past 30 years. "What kind of mother shows up wearing that ridiculous costume when her child is in the emergency room?" my mother hissed, pointing a manicured finger at my graduation gown. I stared at her, completely disoriented. I received 63 missed calls. I panicked. "Is Ethan okay?" "He slipped on the pool deck," my father William interjected, crossing his arms over his polo shirt. "A minor fracture." "But he was crying for his mother, and where were you? Prancing around on a stage for a useless piece of paper while your family actually needed you." His words echoed in the small room, thick with the unearned arrogance that had always defined my father. He looked at me not with the relief of a parent seeing his daughter arrive to support her injured child, but with pure annoyance. The audacity of his words hit me like a physical strike. I turned to my husband David, who was avoiding my eyes. "David, you promised you would watch the kids," I said, my voice rising in disbelief. "You promised you would keep them safe while I attended my graduation. You were supposed to bring them to the ceremony. Instead, you all abandoned me to go to a barbecue, and now you are blaming me for an accident that happened on your watch." David ran a hand through his hair, looking sheepish but defensive. "Olivia, calm down. Derek just installed a new outdoor kitchen and a custom water slide. The kids begged to go. I could not say no to them. Besides, a graduation ceremony is just hours of boring speeches. We wanted to celebrate Derek's new technology startup company. That is an actual real-world achievement." My brother Derek leaned against the hospital wall, swirling a cup of iced coffee he had bought from the cafeteria. He wore a smug, self-satisfied grin. "Come on, Olivia," Derek scoffed. "Do not make this about your hurt feelings. You have been neglecting your husband and your kids for 3 years just to take night classes for a degree in forensic accounting. You should be thanking me for showing them a good time. It is not my fault your kid is clumsy. He took a long sip of his coffee, acting as though he was a gracious host who had done me a massive favor. The entitlement radiating from him was nauseating. I stood there in my graduation gown, looking at the people who were supposed to be my support system. For years, my parents had worshipped Derek. Every failed business venture he launched was treated like a stroke of genius, while my stable, grueling career as a financial investigator was dismissed as boring clerical work. I had spent years working 50-hour weeks and studying late into the night, desperate to earn their respect. But looking at them now, smelling the barbecue smoke on their clothes, I realized the painful truth. They had never intended to celebrate me. They just wanted an excuse to worship Derek. I took a deep breath, refusing to let them see me cry. "Fine," I said coldly. "Ethan is safe, and that is all that matters. Let us get him discharged so we can go home. I will deal with this blatant disrespect later." I reached into my purse to grab my wallet, heading toward the administration desk. But before I could take another step, David suddenly grabbed my elbow. His grip was tight, his palms unusually sweaty. All the bravado he had displayed a moment ago vanished, replaced by a pale, trembling panic. "Olivia, wait," David whispered, his voice cracking as he physically pulled me away from the group and into the secluded hospital corridor. "Let go of me!" I demanded, pulling my arm away. "What is wrong with you?" David swallowed hard, looking over his shoulder to make sure my parents could not hear us. "The fracture is not the urgent problem." He stammered, his eyes darting wildly. "Then why did you call me 63 times?" I asked, my patience completely exhausted. David looked down at his expensive boat shoes. "Because when the hospital billing department asked for our copay, my credit card was declined, so I tried my debit card. That was declined too." I frowned, confused. "That is impossible. We have over $80,000 in the joint savings account. That is the kids' college fund." David looked up at me, his face completely drained of color. "I know," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently I could barely hear him over the hospital intercom. "But it is gone. All of it. I drained the entire $80,000 yesterday morning." I grabbed David by the fabric of his expensive linen shirt and shoved him through the automatic sliding doors. The sweltering afternoon heat of the hospital parking lot hit us instantly, but I felt completely frozen from the inside out. My heavy graduation gown dragged against the dirty concrete as I backed him hard against the side of his luxury SUV. I slammed my hands against the hood of the car, my breathing ragged. $80,000. I repeated, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it blurred my vision. "You drained our children's entire college fund. I am a forensic accountant, David. I spend 50 hours a week tracking hidden assets, fraudulent wire transfers, and corporate embezzlement. How did you steal from our own family right under my nose?" David refused to look me in the eye. He stared down at his designer boat shoes, his face flushed with a pathetic mixture of guilt and defiance. "I logged into your laptop while you were asleep last night," he confessed, his voice dropping to a cowardly whisper. "You were exhausted from studying for your final exams. You left your phone on the nightstand. I initiated the transfer and used your dual authentication app to approve it." The sheer audacity of his betrayal knocked the breath out of my lungs. My own husband had committed felony wire fraud while I was asleep in the bed beside him. I demanded to know where the money went. I demanded to know what kind of financial emergency could possibly justify robbing our son and daughter of their future. David finally looked up, his jaw set with a stubborn, irrational pride. "I did not rob them, Olivia. I invested it. Derek offered me a ground-floor equity stake in his new technology startup." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a terrible joke. My brother Derek had never run a successful business in his life. He was a professional scam artist who used my parents' wealth to fund his lavish lifestyle, jumping from one failed venture to another. "You gave my brother $80,000. I screamed, no longer caring who heard me in the parking lot. "Derek is a fraud. He has no product, no business plan, and no actual investors. You threw our life savings into a black hole. It is not a black hole. David snapped back, his voice rising in sudden anger. You do not understand because you are too busy obsessing over your stupid textbooks. Your brother is brilliant. Your parents believe in him. And for the first time in 12 years of marriage, they actually believe in me too. Do you know how it feels to be treated like a secondary citizen by your own in-laws? They always looked down on me because I married the family disappointment. But yesterday, when I handed Derek that check, your father actually poured me a glass of his expensive scotch. He hugged me. He called me a true son. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. You sold our children's future for a glass of scotch and a pat on the back from my toxic father. I stepped away from him in pure disgust. I reached into the pocket of my dress and pulled out my phone. I am calling the bank to report unauthorized fraudulent activity, and then I am calling the police. You will do no such thing, young lady. The booming, authoritative voice echoed across the asphalt. I turned to see my father William and my mother Catherine marching out of the hospital doors, striding toward us with absolute purpose. My father pointed a thick, accusing finger directly at my face. Put that phone away right now, William demanded, stepping between me and my husband like a bodyguard protecting a highly valued client. David is a man of vision. He made a strategic business decision for his family. Derek is taking his company public in less than 6 months. That $80,000 is going to multiply by 10. You should be down on your knees thanking your husband for securing your financial future while you were busy playing dress-up in that ridiculous graduation outfit. I looked at my father, completely disgusted by his blatant manipulation. You convinced him to steal my money to fund Derek's fake company. You knew he bypassed my security protocols. That is a federal crime. My mother? Catherine scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Olivia. You are always so narrow-minded and jealous of your brother. We advised David to make the investment because we knew you would be too stubborn and selfish to help your own flesh and blood. Derek's barbecue today was a crucial networking event for the new company. We needed to show the angel investors that we have a united, wealthy family front. But instead of supporting your brother, you ruined the entire vibe by demanding people sit in a stuffy auditorium to watch you get a piece of paper. They were completely comfortable with a felony as long as it benefited their golden child. They had actively manipulated my weak approval-starved husband into committing financial fraud, and now they were gaslighting me into believing I was the villain for being angry about it. I am filing a police report, I said, my voice dropping to an absolute icy calm. I will see all of you in a courtroom. Before my father could launch into another tirade, the automatic sliding doors of the emergency room hissed open. My heart immediately leaped into my throat. My 14-year-old son Ethan walked out into the sunlight. His right arm was wrapped in a thick, bright white fiberglass cast held up by a dark blue sling. His younger sister Mia walked quietly behind him, looking nervously at the ground. Ethan, baby. I gasped, rushing forward to wrap my arms around him. I am so sorry I was not there when you fell. Does it hurt badly? Let me see. I reached out to gently touch his uninjured shoulder, but Ethan flinched and took a harsh step backward. He pulled away from me as if my touch physically burned him. Do not touch me. Ethan snapped, his young voice dripping with a venomous anger I had never heard from him before. He glared at me, his eyes narrowing with pure, unfiltered hostility. I froze, my hand suspended in the air. Ethan, what is wrong? It is me. Uncle Derek is right, Ethan said loudly, making sure my parents and my husband could hear every single word. You only think about yourself. You never care about what we want. Uncle Derek just bought me a $2,000 custom mountain bike to make me feel better about my arm, while you did not even care enough to show up to the party. I stepped back into the warm, dry foyer and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I stood on the porch for a long moment, the freezing Seattle rain plastering my hair to my face, staring at the heavy oak door my father had just slammed in my face. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or beg for them to let me back inside. The profound betrayal I had endured over the past 24 hours had completely burned away any remaining warmth or desperation I felt toward these people. I turned on my heel, walked back to my car, and drove to a cheap roadside motel near the interstate highway. I paid for a room using the emergency cash I always kept hidden in the lining of my purse. I spent the entire night sitting in wet clothes on the edge of a sagging mattress, shivering under a thin, scratchy blanket, staring blankly at the water stains on the ceiling. I did not sleep a single minute. Instead, my mind methodically categorized the events like a massive financial ledger. David had committed felony wire fraud. My parents had aided and abetted him. My brother was the direct beneficiary of stolen funds. My children were being actively manipulated and poisoned against me. Debits and credits, crimes and liabilities. By 6 in the morning, I was out the door. I stopped at a high-end department store the exact second they unlocked their doors. I purchased a sharp-tailored charcoal gray suit and a crisp white silk blouse, swiping my corporate expense card. I changed in the store fitting room, pulled my damp hair back into a tight, severe bun, and threw my ruined graduation dress into a nearby trash can. I bought a double shot of black espresso from a corner cafe and walked through the massive revolving glass doors of the Vanguard Financial Forensics building in downtown Seattle. This was my territory. In my family, I was the boring, negative daughter with a useless degree who could never measure up to my charismatic brother. But on the 42nd floor of this towering glass skyscraper, I was Olivia, the lead forensic investigator. I managed a highly specialized team of 30 elite financial analysts. I was the exact person federal agencies called when they needed someone to track millions of dollars hidden securely behind complex shell companies' offshore accounts and encrypted offshore transactions. I ripped apart fraudulent corporate structures for a living. I traced laundered money across global networks. David and my parents thought I simply sat in a cubicle crunching boring numbers all day. They had absolutely no idea that I spent my days dismantling untouchable white-collar criminals with surgical, terrifying precision. I walked past rows of glass offices, acknowledging the respectful nods from my junior analysts. I stepped into my massive corner office, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray, rain-swept city below. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk, the heat of the paper espresso cup seeping into my freezing hands. My computer screen flickered to life. I opened a blank document, fully intending to start drafting the legal paperwork required to freeze every remaining asset connected to David, to lock him out of our joint life entirely. I was preparing to declare war on my own husband. Before my fingers could even touch the keyboard, my office door swung open. Marcus, the senior managing partner at Vanguard, walked in holding a thick red classified folder. He looked unusually tense, the deep lines on his face prominent in the morning light. He did not bother with his usual pleasantries or ask about my weekend. He walked straight up to me and dropped the heavy file squarely onto the center of my pristine desk. "We just got a top priority request directly from the Securities and Exchange Commission," Marcus said, leaning both of his hands heavily on my desk. "I need you to drop whatever case you are currently working on and take the lead on this immediately. The SEC is gearing up for a massive federal raid, but they need our firm to map the entire money trail before the executives realize they are being watched and try to flee the country." I took a slow sip of my bitter espresso, my professional instincts instantly overriding my personal exhaustion and family trauma. "What kind of fraud are we looking at?" I asked, pulling the heavy red folder closer to me. "It is a massive, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme dressed up as a revolutionary technology startup." Marcus explained, his expression grim and utterly serious. "They have been aggressively courting retail investors, convincing regular people to drain their life savings and retirement accounts under the guise of an upcoming initial public offering. They claim to have developed a groundbreaking artificial intelligence product that will change the global market. But the SEC strongly suspects there is absolutely zero underlying technology. The company is completely hollow." Marcus tapped the cover of the folder with his index finger. "The executives are burning through millions of dollars of stolen investor capital every single month. They are buying luxury sports cars, chartering private jets, and purchasing lavish real estate, all while artificially faking their user acquisition metrics to attract even more unsuspecting victims. The entire operation is a fragile house of cards, and it is about to completely collapse. I need your team to trace exactly where the stolen funds are going. The CEO is incredibly slippery. He is using decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges and dummy corporations to hide the capital. Find those hidden accounts, Olivia. I want you to nail this guy to the wall. Consider it done. I replied smoothly, picking up my favorite steel pen. Marcus nodded, looking visibly relieved that his best investigator was officially on the case. He turned around and walked out of my office, closing the glass door securely behind him. I set my coffee cup down on a coaster. I reached out and flipped open the heavy red cover of the highly classified SEC file. I began to scan the first page of the executive summary, my eyes scanning the federal charges and the preliminary asset list. Then my eyes drifted down to the target company profile. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. Printed in bold, undeniable black ink at the top of the federal investigation warrant was the company name, Nexus Tech. Right below the company name was the official listing for the primary suspect, the chief executive officer orchestrating the entire multi-million-dollar scam, Derek Williams, my golden child brother. The sheer absurdity of the revelation forced a sharp, humorless laugh from my throat. My father had literally shut me out in the freezing rain to protect the sleep cycle of a federal criminal. My husband had drained our children's college fund to invest in a massive federally monitored Ponzi scheme. I did not waste another second feeling sorry for myself. I cracked my knuckles, pulled my keyboard close, and went to work. For the next 9 hours, I did not leave my desk. I pulled every subpoenaed bank record, wire transfer log, and corporate tax filing associated with Nexus Tech. As a forensic accountant, I had dismantled complex financial networks operated by international cartels, but Derek's financial structure was almost insultingly amateur. It was exactly what you would expect from a narcissistic golden child who believed he was inherently smarter than everyone else in the room. He had set up a web of 6 dummy corporations in Delaware and Nevada, using them to funnel new investor capital directly into his personal checking accounts. The money flow was glaringly obvious. When an investor wired $50,000 for shares of his revolutionary artificial intelligence software, Derek would immediately transfer $40,000 of it to a shell company called Apex Holdings. From Apex, the funds were wired to a luxury car dealership, a high-end real estate broker, and a private jet charter company. He was using the remaining $10,000 to pay off early investors, creating the illusion of massive profit returns. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, and it was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. I tracked the transactions line by line, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitors. I found David's $80,000 wire transfer. It had hit Nexus Tech's primary account at 9 in the morning 2 days ago. By noon, Derek had completely drained it to cover a past due invoice for a private yacht rental to Cabo San Lucas. My children's entire college fund was gone in 3 hours to pay for my brother's tropical vacation. A cold, mechanical rage settled over me. I compiled the evidence, categorizing every fraudulent transfer, highlighting every stolen dollar. By the time I finally pushed my chair back, the sun had set, plunging the Seattle skyline into darkness. The office was completely empty. I grabbed my purse and headed down the elevator to the underground parking garage. My mind was already calculating the next steps of the federal raid, mapping out exactly how Marcus and the SEC would freeze Derek's assets by Friday. The concrete parking structure was dimly lit and eerily quiet, my heels echoing sharply against the pavement. I was 10 feet away from my car when the blinding glare of headlights suddenly pinned me against the concrete pillar. A massive, sleek black SUV tore around the corner, its tires screeching loudly as it slammed on the brakes, blocking my path entirely. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached into my purse, my fingers wrapping tightly around my pepper spray. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and a tall, striking woman stepped out into the dim fluorescent light. I slowly let go of my pepper spray. It was Jasmine. Jasmine was Derek's wife. She was a brilliant structural engineer, a fiercely intelligent black woman who had built her own highly successful consulting firm from the ground up. And because she was a self-made woman of color from a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, my parents treated her with a vile, thinly veiled disdain. William and Catherine constantly made passive-aggressive comments about her hair, her ambition, and her background. They treated her like an outsider who should simply be grateful that their golden boy had deigned to marry her. Jasmine and I had never been particularly close, mostly because Derek actively kept us apart, but we shared the silent, heavy burden of surviving my toxic family. Jasmine did not look like the polished, composed woman who usually gritted her teeth through our horrific family Thanksgiving dinners. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, her jaw set with a fierce, uncompromising determination. She wore a dark trench coat, and she was clutching a small silver object in her right hand. "Jasmine, what are you doing here?" I asked, glancing nervously around the empty parking garage. She walked quickly toward me, her heels clicking against the concrete. "I knew you would be working late," she said, her voice tight and urgent. "I have been watching Derek for 8 months, Olivia. I know exactly what he is doing. I know about the dummy corporations. I know about the offshore accounts. I tried to warn your parents, but your father told me I was just an ungrateful wife who did not understand complex business strategy." A bitter smile crossed her lips as she shook her head. "He thinks I am just a stupid accessory. But I am an engineer. I know how to look at a structure and see exactly where the cracks are. Nexus Tech is collapsing and Derek is preparing to run." I stared at her, stunned by her absolute clarity. "The SEC is already building the case, Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice low. "I am running the forensic trace right now. It is over. He is going to federal prison. He is taking everyone down with him." She fired back, stepping into my personal space. "He has been draining the investor accounts dry." Jasmine reached out and pressed the small silver object into my palm. It was a heavy encrypted USB drive. "I copied his entire hard drive before I packed my bags and left him this afternoon." Jasmine stated, her eyes flashing with a righteous, terrifying anger. "Derek is siphoning the investment funds to buy supercars and keep a 22-year-old mistress in an upscale penthouse downtown. I have the receipts, the text messages, and the wire transfers proving all of it. I want you to give this to the federal investigators. I want to watch him burn." I gripped the metal drive tightly in my fist, a wave of profound respect washing over me. "You have everything they need to secure a conviction," I promised her. "Thank you, Jasmine." She took a step back toward her idling SUV, but then she paused. She looked at me, a deep, sorrowful pity shadowing her features. "Do not thank me yet, Olivia," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Derek is a monster, but your husband is a complete coward. When you plug that drive into your computer, skip the investor lists. Open file number 4 and see what your husband did with your house." Before I could ask her what she meant, Jasmine turned around, climbed back into her black SUV, and sped out of the parking garage, leaving me standing alone in the cold concrete silence with the USB drive burning a hole in my hand. I turned on my heel and walked straight back to the private executive elevator. I hit the button for the 42nd floor. The ride up felt agonizingly slow, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I marched past the empty cubicles of my junior analysts, the silence of the Vanguard financial forensics floor serving as a stark contrast to the storm raging inside my head. I locked my office door, sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, and plugged Jasmine's silver USB drive into my secure offline terminal. The drive flashed onto my screen. Jasmine had meticulously organized everything. There were dozens of folders labeled with offshore account numbers, cryptocurrency wallet addresses, and digital copies of Derek's encrypted communications. I ignored the folders containing evidence of his 22-year-old mistress and the lavish penthouse lease. I was not interested in Derek's predictable infidelity. I was hunting for the financial kill shot. My cursor hovered over a folder simply titled File 4. I double-clicked. A massive, highly detailed PDF document populated my second monitor. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the bold, standardized legal header. It was a home equity line of credit agreement, a HELOC. I scrolled down to the property description and the breath was instantly knocked out of my lungs. The address listed was my house. The suburban home I had poured my life savings into, the home where my children slept, the property I had painstakingly renovated and maintained while David bounced between mediocre sales jobs. I quickly dragged the scroll bar to the financial summary section. The total approved loan amount was an additional $300,000. A wave of absolute nausea washed over me. I clicked down to the final page of the digital document, searching for the authorization signatures. There, printed in neat blue ink, was David's signature. Right below it, on the line designated for the primary property owner, was my name, Olivia. It was an incredibly convincing forgery, mimicking the exact loop of my cursive letters. Beside my forged signature was a bright red digital notary stamp. I stared at the name on the stamp. Gregory Vance. Gregory was David's college roommate, a licensed public notary who frequently visited our house for weekend barbecues. David had not just forged my signature. He had conspired with his best friend to legally authenticate a fraudulent federal banking document. I frantically pulled up the disbursement logs attached to the final page of the PDF. The entire $300,000 credit line had been withdrawn in a single lump sum transfer exactly 72 hours ago. The destination routing number matched the exact Apex Holdings account I had been tracking earlier. David had mortgaged the roof over my children's heads to pump $300,000 of stolen equity directly into my brother's collapsing Ponzi scheme. The sheer calculated malice of his actions paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. If I had not discovered this tonight, the sequence of events would have been entirely fatal to my future. The Securities and Exchange Commission was preparing to raid Nexus Tech and freeze all affiliated accounts by the end of the week. Once the federal government seized Derek's assets, the startup would immediately dissolve. The massive HELOC loan would default, and the bank would aggressively foreclose on my house to recoup their $300,000. I would be left completely bankrupt, homeless, and financially ruined, all while David played the innocent victim alongside my toxic parents. They had planned to completely destroy my life to fund their luxury illusion. I did not cry. I did not scream. The time for emotional breakdowns had ended the moment David locked me out of my own home in the freezing rain. I was the lead forensic investigator for Vanguard Financial. I destroyed arrogant white-collar criminals for a living, and David had just handed me the murder weapon. I opened the highly secure SEC Federal Evidence Portal on my primary monitor. I dragged and dropped the forged HELOC agreement, the routing numbers, and the notary stamp directly into the active federal warrant file. I tagged Gregory Vance as a co-conspirator to federal bank fraud. I flagged David's financial transfers under the Patriot Act for identity theft and felony wire fraud. By the time I hit submit, the evidence was securely locked into the federal database. There was no walking it back, no negotiating. The federal government now had irrefutable proof of their crimes. I was going to ensure that David and Derek shared adjoining cells in a federal penitentiary. I spent the next hour copying Jasmine's entire USB drive onto 3 separate encrypted hard drives, securing the backups in my biometric floor safe. I drafted a swift, vicious email to the top divorce litigator in Seattle, attaching the forged loan documents and demanding an emergency ex parte hearing to secure full physical custody of Ethan and Mia. David had proven himself to be a severe financial and physical danger to our children. Just as I hit send on the email to my attorney, my cell phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of my desk. The sudden noise made me jump. I picked up the device. The screen lit up with a new text message from my mother, Catherine. I stared at the preview notification, expecting another toxic lecture about my behavior at the hospital or another demand that I apologize to my husband. Instead, the message read like a surreal, twisted joke. "Come to Le Cirque restaurant immediately." My mother wrote her text dripping with customary entitlement. "Derek is throwing a celebration party for his successful fundraising round. Make sure you bring your credit card. David forgot his wallet." I read the words 3 times, letting the absolute breathtaking audacity of the message sink into my bones. My brother was currently burning through $300,000 of my stolen home equity. My husband had committed federal bank fraud and locked me out of my own house. My mother had stood by and cheered as they poisoned my son against me. And now they wanted me to show up at a ridiculously expensive 5-star French restaurant to physically pay for their celebration using my own credit card. They truly believed I was a weak, obedient ATM machine who would simply fall in line to maintain the illusion of family harmony. They thought they had entirely broken my spirit. I locked my computer terminal, slipped my phone into my pocket, and grabbed my coat. I walked out of my office, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. I was going to Le Cirque. I was going to sit at their table, look them directly in the eyes, and watch them celebrate the exact crimes that were about to destroy their entire lives. I handed the keys of my unremarkable sedan to the valet outside Le Cirque. The Seattle rain was still coming down in freezing, relentless sheets, but stepping through the heavy, velvet-draped doors of the restaurant was like crossing the threshold into another universe. Warm, golden light reflected off massive crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the rich, intoxicating scent of roasted garlic, browned butter, and old money. The maitre d' gave my damp hair and severe charcoal gray business suit a hesitant look before I gave him the reservation name. He silently escorted me through the maze of pristine white tablecloths to a private elevated alcove at the very back of the main dining room. There they were, my family. They were occupying a massive circular leather booth, laughing loudly and clinking crystal goblets filled with deep red French burgundy. The table was an absolute graveyard of extreme culinary indulgence. Empty oyster shells resting on beds of crushed ice, half-eaten plates of Wagyu beef smothered in thick shavings of black truffles, and towering silver dessert stands littered the center of the table. Every single bite of that luxury, every drop of that expensive vintage wine was paid for by the blood, sweat, and stolen equity of innocent investors. And my own home. David sat wedged between my father William and my brother Derek. My husband was grinning like a sycophantic lapdog who had finally been allowed to sit at the adults' table. My mother Catherine was holding court at the head of the booth, her neck draped in heavy diamond jewelry that was undoubtedly purchased with Derek's fraudulent corporate funds. I stopped at the edge of their table. The raucous laughter died down instantly. David had the nerve to look briefly terrified, his eyes darting frantically to my face to see if I was going to scream, throw a glass of wine, or cause a massive public scene. Instead, I stood completely still, my posture rigid, my expression an absolute unreadable void. Derek leaned back in his plush leather chair, swirling the expensive burgundy in his glass. He flashed me his signature $1 million smile, the exact same charismatic predatory grin he used to charm gullible investors out of their life savings. "Look who finally decided to show up." Derek sneered, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "The prodigal sister graces us with her presence." He tapped his silver dessert spoon against his crystal glass, loudly demanding the attention of our table and several annoyed diners seated nearby. "I would like to propose a toast," Derek announced, raising his glass high. "To my dear sister Olivia. She spent 5 miserable years burying her face in boring textbooks just to get a useless master's degree. She missed family events. She ignored her husband. And for what? Meanwhile, your high school-educated brother just closed a massive 8-figure funding round for Nexus Tech. It just goes to show that fancy pieces of paper and forensic degrees mean absolutely nothing in the real world. Let us raise a glass to actual success. Let us raise a glass to cash flow." David chuckled eagerly, raising his own glass to tap against Derek's. I watched my husband, the man who had just forged my signature to steal $300,000 of our home equity, actively laugh at my humiliation. My mother beamed with immense pride, her eyes fixed entirely on her golden, fraudulent son. Catherine reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick black leather folio, and slid it aggressively across the white tablecloth. It stopped directly in front of my hands. "Pay this, Olivia," Catherine commanded, her tone absolutely leaving no room for argument or negotiation. Consider it your contribution to your brother's massive success today. Since you ruined the mood at the hospital yesterday and acted like a complete lunatic, it is the absolute least you can do to make amends. David forgot his wallet at the house, and Derek certainly should not have to pay for his own celebration party. I looked down at the itemized receipt protruding from the leather folio. $4,280. They had ordered the most expensive bottles from the reserve cellar, imported caviar, and extra truffles purely to run up the tab, fully intending to force me into paying it. In the past, this blatant financial abuse would have sent me into a desperate spiral of anxiety and anger. I would have argued, I would have cried, I would have begged them to be reasonable. But tonight, knowing that the Securities and Exchange Commission was currently reading the files I had just sent them, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold clinical anticipation. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my heavy metal Vanguard Financial Corporate black card. I dropped it silently onto the silver tray. The waiter, who had been hovering nervously in the shadows, quickly snatched it up and vanished toward the kitchen. David let out a loud exhale, visibly relieved, clearly assuming my silent submission meant I was finally bending to his control and accepting my place in the family hierarchy. My father gave an approving grunt, returning his attention to his steak. "You are finally learning how to behave," William muttered, slicing through the expensive meat without looking up. "It is about time you supported your brother." I waited exactly until the waiter returned. I took the silver pen, signed the merchant copy with a perfectly steady hand, and tucked my corporate card back into my pocket. Then I rested my hands on the table and looked directly across the expensive spread into Derek's arrogant, flushed face. "You are absolutely right, Derek," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that cut straight through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a scalpel. "Degrees really do not matter as much as cash flow. Speaking of cash flow, you should really enjoy that brand new Porsche 911 GT3. The matte black one. The one with the custom license plate 7X9-B21. It is a truly beautiful machine." The smug, arrogant grin vanished from Derek's face instantly. His jaw went completely slack. The color drained from his skin so fast he looked physically ill. The wine glass in his hand trembled violently, spilling a few drops of dark red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. No one in the family knew about that car. Derek had secretly purchased it 3 days ago using a shell company registered in Delaware, deliberately using a fake name to hide the stolen asset from both his wife Jasmine and the corporate auditors. It was completely off the books, buried under layers of fake invoices that I had just finished decrypting at my office. "How do you know about that plate?" Derek choked out, his voice reduced to a terrified, breathless whisper. His eyes darted around the restaurant as if he expected federal agents to suddenly swarm the table. I smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that made David physically flinch and press himself back into the leather booth. "Have a wonderful night, everyone. Enjoy the truffles," I said, my voice perfectly calm. I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the entire table sitting in absolute horrified silence. I stepped out into the freezing Seattle rain, leaving the suffocating opulence of Le Cirque behind. The valet handed me my keys, and I tipped him generously before sliding into the cold leather seat of my sedan. I did not drive to our house in the suburbs. That house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene currently mortgaged to the hilt to fund a collapsing federal Ponzi scheme. Instead, I drove back to my cheap roadside motel, caught exactly 3 hours of restless sleep, and spent the entire next morning sitting in the sterile glass-walled conference room of Seattle's most ruthless divorce litigator. Armed with the encrypted backups from Jasmine's USB drive, the forged home equity line of credit documents, and the irrefutable proof of David's wire fraud, my attorney moved with lethal speed. By 2 in the afternoon, we stood before a family court judge in an emergency ex parte hearing. The judge took one look at the heavily documented financial endangerment and immediately granted a temporary protective order. David was stripped of all physical and legal custody rights, pending a full federal investigation. I walked out of the courthouse holding the signed judicial order that gave me sole authority to secure my children. I just had to physically get them away from him. I pulled into the circular manicured driveway of Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy precisely at 3:15. The afternoon rain had cleared, leaving a crisp, biting chill in the air. I parked my sedan behind a long line of luxury SUVs and waited for the dismissal bell to ring. Ethan and Mia walked out of the heavy mahogany doors 10 minutes later. Ethan, 14 years old, had his headphones shoved deep into his ears, his posture slouching with typical teenage apathy. Mia, 11, walked a few paces behind him. I stepped out of my car, offering a warm, reassuring smile. I had not seen them since David slammed the heavy oak door in my face. I stepped forward to greet them. Mia stopped dead in her tracks. She gripped the thick canvas straps of her expensive backpack, her knuckles turning bone white. Her eyes narrowed, flashing with an intense, familiar hostility that mirrored my mother's exact expression. Suddenly, she hurled the heavy backpack onto the wet pavement with a loud, aggressive thud. "I do not want to go with you," Mia screamed, her high-pitched voice echoing sharply across the pristine drop-off zone. Several parents standing nearby stopped their conversations. They turned their heads, their eyes wide with suburban scandal, openly watching the scene unfold. "Mia, get in the car." Ethan muttered, clearly mortified by the public display, but he did not move to intervene or help his sister pick up her bag. "No!" Mia shrieked, tears of manufactured dramatic rage streaming down her flushed cheeks. "Dad told us everything last night. He said you are completely selfish. He said you want to steal our house and kick us out onto the street just so Dad does not have any money to invest in Uncle Derek's new company. You are jealous of them. You are trying to ruin our family." The words hit me with the devastating heavy force of a physical blow. The absolute depravity of his actions washed over me. David had not simply forged my signature on federal bank documents. He had deliberately weaponized our children. He had sat them down, likely the exact second I was locked out in the rain, and meticulously brainwashed them. He twisted his own felony wire fraud into a twisted fairy tale where I was the greedy, vindictive villain stealing their future, and he was the noble father trying to build generational wealth with my golden child brother. He was actively poisoning their minds to ensure they would hate me by the time the FBI kicked his door down. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysteria. I did not try to explain complex forensic accounting to an 11-year-old in a school parking lot. I took a slow, measured step forward, projecting the absolute, unwavering authority I utilized in federal interrogation rooms. "Your father lied to you, Mia," I stated firmly, my voice carrying absolutely no anger, only cold, immutable fact. "Pick up your bag and get in the vehicle right now." She blinked, her tears instantly stopping. She was clearly expecting me to beg, cry, or apologize exactly the way I used to whenever my parents cornered me and demanded submission. The sheer, immovable ice in my tone broke entirely through her rehearsed tantrum. She sniffled, picked up her damp backpack, and climbed into the back seat without saying another word. Ethan silently slid into the passenger side, putting his window down and refusing to make eye contact. I let out a slow, deeply controlled breath, wrapping my hand around the driver's side door handle, fully prepared to take my children to a secure hotel away from David's reach. "Mrs. Vance, a moment, please." I turned to see Ms. Albright, Mia's homeroom teacher, jogging down the concrete steps. She clutched a bright yellow piece of paper in her hand, looking deeply uncomfortable and slightly breathless. "I apologize for the delay," Ms. Albright said, handing me the paper. It was the official invoice for the upcoming European history field trip, an extravagant 3-week excursion to Paris and Rome. "Your husband called the administrative office this morning. He sounded extremely distressed. He said his primary credit cards were temporarily locked due to a banking error and that you were handling the finances. He explicitly requested that we charge this semester's remaining tuition and the $15,000 trip fee directly to your personal corporate account." I stared at the bright yellow invoice, the black ink blurring slightly before my eyes. David was not just stealing my home equity to funnel cash into Derek's collapsing Ponzi scheme. He was actively, systematically attempting to drain every single cent of my personal liquidity before the inevitable federal raid. He wanted to bleed me entirely dry, saddling me with massive, non-refundable prepayments, so I would be too financially paralyzed to hire a decent attorney or fight back in divorce court. He was attempting to leave me destitute. I carefully folded the yellow paper and placed it into my purse. "I will handle it, Ms. Albright," I replied smoothly. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel until my hands ached. David thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess. He had absolutely no idea that I was about to flip the entire board. I threw my car into drive and merged aggressively onto the slick Seattle highway. I did not go back to my office. I did not go to a hotel. I drove straight to the downtown headquarters of Pacific Century Bank, the massive financial institution that held the primary mortgage on my home. This was not a customer service visit. This was a tactical strike. I marched through the heavy revolving glass doors, completely ignoring the velvet ropes and the long line of regular customers waiting for tellers. I walked directly to the polished mahogany desk of the executive suite receptionist. When she stood up and opened her mouth to ask if I had an appointment, I dropped my heavy Vanguard Financial Forensics badge and my federal SEC clearance credential directly onto her keyboard. "I need the senior branch manager right now." I stated, my voice carrying the absolute uncompromising authority of a federal raid. "We have an active multi-million-dollar wire fraud situation and your institution is currently holding the liability." Within 90 seconds, I was sitting in a soundproof glass office across from Richard Sterling, the senior vice president of the branch. He looked visibly nervous, his eyes darting frantically between my federal credentials and my face. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my laptop, turned the screen toward him, and pulled up the $300,000 home equity line of credit document. "This document was processed and funded by your branch exactly 72 hours ago." I said, my tone clinical and razor-sharp. "It is entirely fraudulent. I am officially reporting grand larceny, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud." Richard adjusted his tie, leaning forward to look at the screen. "Mrs. Vance, I understand you are upset, but this document was legally processed. It was digitally submitted with a verified public notary stamp, and it clearly bears your husband's signature alongside your own. It bears a forgery." I corrected him immediately. I pulled out my digital stylus and enlarged the signature block on the high-resolution screen until the ink strokes filled the monitor. I am a lead forensic investigator. I dismantle laundered financial structures for the federal government for a living. Look closely at the pen pressure on the letter D in David's name and the loop of the O in my name. Richard squinted at the screen. "I do not see what you are pointing at." "My husband David is severely left-handed," I explained, stripping away the mystery with surgical precision. "When a left-handed person signs a physical document, there is a distinct heavy drag of ink from left to right as they push the pen across the paper. The pressure points are entirely localized on the downward left curves. Now look at the signature. The ink was deposited by pulling the pen. The slant, the friction, and the kinetic flow of the ink are unequivocally right-handed. David physically could not have signed this document." Before Richard could argue, I pulled up a second document from Jasmine's decrypted USB drive. It was a corporate tax filing signed by my brother Derek. "Now compare the forged signatures to this," I said, placing the two images side by side. "Notice the aggressive right-handed downward stroke on the capital letters, the sharp hook on the lower loops. It is an exact biometric match. My husband did not even have the courage to forge this document himself. My brother Derek forged both our signatures. David supplied his college roommate's notary stamp to bypass your security checks, and your bank recklessly approved a $300,000 loan without ever verifying the applicants in person." Richard physically recoiled, the color completely draining from his face. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead. "We followed standard digital banking protocols, Mrs. Vance. If what you are saying is true, this is a severe federal matter." "It is already a federal matter," I replied coldly, snapping my laptop shut. "The Securities and Exchange Commission is currently building a RICO case against Nexus Tech, the exact shell company where these funds were wired. If you do not freeze this credit line and immediately lock every single account associated with David Vance, Your specific branch will be legally implicated in aiding and abetting a massive federal Ponzi scheme. Lock it down, now." The threat of a federal indictment and the sheer terror of SEC involvement was the ultimate motivator. Richard did not hesitate or ask another question. His fingers flew across his keyboard in a frantic blur. Within 3 minutes, the fraudulent HELOC was flagged and frozen. My home title was locked under a severe federal fraud alert, preventing any further borrowing or foreclosure actions. Then Richard targeted David's personal finances. Every checking account, every savings account, and every credit card with David's name attached to it was completely locked. He was financially paralyzed. He could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone fund his delusional lifestyle. The bleeding was finally stopped. I walked out of the bank and stepped onto the bustling Seattle sidewalk. The freezing rain had stopped, and the crisp, sharp air filled my lungs. The crushing, suffocating weight of potentially losing my home had vanished, replaced entirely by the intoxicating electric thrill of absolute control. I had taken my power back. I was halfway to my car when my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. The caller ID flashed David's smiling face. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. "What the hell did you do to my accounts?" David screamed. His voice was cracking with pure, unadulterated panic and severe embarrassment. The background noise behind him sounded echoing and hollow, accompanied by classical music. It sounded exactly like a high-end retail store. "My cards are declining," he shrieked, entirely losing his composure. "The bank teller on the phone just told me my accounts are locked for suspected fraud. Olivia, fix this right now. Do you hear me? Fix it." "I cannot help you, David," I replied, my tone dangerously calm and perfectly level. "Where exactly are you?" "I am at the downtown jewelry showroom." He yelled, his humiliation bleeding through the speaker. Derek wanted to celebrate his successful funding round. I am trying to buy him a Rolex as a congratulatory gift, and my platinum card just declined 3 times in front of the entire sales staff. They are looking at me like I am a criminal. "You need to unlock the accounts before Derek realizes what is happening." I stopped walking. I looked up at the clearing gray sky, a slow, dark, and highly satisfied smile spreading across my face. He was trying to buy a luxury watch for the man who was currently stealing our children's future. "I am just practicing what I learned from my useless degree, David," I said smoothly. "Enjoy the Rolex." I ended the call and immediately blocked David's number. I stood on the Seattle sidewalk for a long moment, letting the freezing night air fill my lungs. The game was finally over, and I was the one holding all the winning pieces. I drove back to my motel, lay down on the cheap mattress, and slept with the absolute dreamless peace of a woman who had just reclaimed her entire existence. The next morning, I arrived at the Vanguard Financial Forensics building before the sun even crested the city skyline. I bypassed my usual coffee stop and went straight to my 42nd floor office. The atmosphere on the floor was already crackling with high-stakes tension. The Securities and Exchange Commission had received the encrypted files I transmitted the night before. Federal agents were actively staging outside Nexus Tech's downtown headquarters, preparing to execute the asset seizure warrants. I sat at my mahogany desk, watching the live banking feeds on my monitor, as Derek's fraudulent accounts were systematically frozen by the government. It was exactly 9:15 in the morning when the pristine, focused silence of my department was violently shattered. Loud, aggressive shouting echoed from the main reception area, completely drowning out the low hum of ringing phones and typing analysts. I pushed my chair back, my instincts instantly on high alert. The heavy glass doors of the investigative wing swung open, and I walked out into the massive marble lobby. My entire family had stormed the floor. They looked like a pack of desperate cornered wolves. Derek was sweating profusely, his expensive designer suit looking rumpled and unkempt. David was pacing erratically, his face pale with sheer terror. But it was my father, William, who led the charge. He had somehow bullied his way past the downstairs security desk and was currently screaming at my terrified receptionist. When William spotted me emerging from the glass corridor, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. He marched across the polished marble floor, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly, and stopped just feet away from me. He raised a trembling finger, pointing it directly at my face in front of 50 elite financial investigators. "You are an absolute monster," William roared, his voice carrying the full, unchecked entitlement he had wielded over me my entire life. "You dared to lock your husband's bank accounts. You are making your own brother completely unable to rotate his investment capital. You are ruining his business deals out of pure jealousy. Unlock those accounts right this second." The entire department fell dead silent. Analysts peered over their cubicle walls. Junior associates froze with documents in their hands. Everyone was watching the lead forensic investigator being publicly attacked by a raging madman. I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes. I stood my ground, my posture immaculate, radiating the cold, surgical authority I used to break white-collar criminals. "I do not have a magical button on my desk to unlock those accounts, William," I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the silent lobby, sharp as shattered glass. "I did not freeze David's money out of spite. The federal government froze those assets because your son-in-law committed felony wire fraud and identity theft to fund Derek's illegal Ponzi scheme." David let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, shrinking behind my father. Derek's eyes darted frantically toward the exit, realizing that his grand illusion was being publicly dismantled. "You are lying!" My father screamed, refusing to accept reality. "You are just a bitter, vindictive woman trying to tear down your brother because you could never achieve what he has. He is a millionaire. You are just a glorified accountant. Fix the bank accounts now, or I will make sure you are fired for this. There is no capital left to rotate." I replied, my tone completely merciless. "Derek is not a millionaire. He is a thief. He has been stealing from unsuspecting investors to buy luxury cars and fund his mistress. And when he ran out of cash, David forged my signature on a federal banking document to mortgage my home for $300,000. The Securities and Exchange Commission is currently raiding his office. By noon today, both of your golden boys will be wearing federal handcuffs." The absolute certainty in my voice finally shattered their delusion. Derek physically stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if he could not breathe. David dropped his face into his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Two towering corporate security guards stepped off the elevator, their radios buzzing with urgent static. They took one look at the hostile men surrounding me and immediately moved in. "Escort these people off the premises immediately," I ordered the guards, my voice devoid of any emotion. "If they resist, call the Seattle Police Department and have them arrested for criminal trespassing." The guards grabbed David and Derek by the arms, dragging them toward the heavy glass doors. My father tried to shove a guard away, sputtering threats and demanding respect, but he was swiftly overpowered. That was when my mother, Catherine, realized that intimidation and authority had completely failed. Stripped of her power, she resorted to her ultimate, most toxic weapon: public manipulation. Catherine let out a piercing, theatrical shriek and threw herself violently onto the cold marble floor. She collapsed in a heap of designer clothing, slapping her palms against the ground and weeping hysterically. "Someone help us!" Catherine wailed, projecting her voice to ensure every single person in the office heard her manufactured agony. "My daughter is an abusive, unfilial monster. We gave her everything. We loved her. And now she is abusing her own parents. She is stealing our money and trying to throw her family onto the street. Please, someone call the police on her. She is mentally unstable. She is trying to destroy us." The performance was grotesque. She thrashed on the floor, weeping and clutching at the legs of a passing associate, playing the role of a battered, victimized elder to absolute perfection. The sheer embarrassment of the spectacle was designed to break me, to force me into submission, just to make the public scene stop. But I simply looked down at her, feeling nothing but profound pity for a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. Before I could instruct the security guards to physically lift her off the floor, the heavy, soundproof mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung open. Marcus, the senior managing partner of Vanguard Financial Forensics, stepped out into the lobby. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, holding a stack of federal briefing files. He surveyed the absolute chaos unfolding in his pristine corporate office. He looked at David and Derek being restrained by security. He looked at my father shouting empty threats. He looked at my mother sobbing and thrashing on the marble floor. Finally, his sharp, calculating eyes locked onto me standing in the center of the storm. Marcus walked slowly across the lobby, the clicking of his leather shoes cutting through my mother's theatrical wails. The entire floor held its breath. He stopped right in front of me, his expression completely unreadable, his imposing presence immediately silencing my father's shouting. "Olivia." Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, commanding timbre that carried absolute finality. "Your family drama is affecting this company." Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The sheer freezing weight of his authority was enough to make every single person in the lobby hold their breath. He looked down at my mother, who was still sprawled on the marble floor, her manufactured tears instantly drying up under his clinical, unimpressed scrutiny. He then looked at the security guards holding my husband and my brother. "Get these men out of my building." Marcus ordered, his tone flat and absolute. "If they or this woman ever set foot within 500 yards of this plaza, again, bypass the local police and contact Federal Protective Services. We house classified SEC documents here. Treat this as a corporate security breach." The guards immediately hauled David and Derek through the heavy glass revolving doors. My mother scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with a mixture of terror and profound humiliation. She brushed off her designer skirt, refusing to look me in the eye, and practically sprinted out of the lobby to chase after her golden son. Once the heavy doors clicked shut, Marcus turned his gaze to me. "My office, right now," he said. I followed him in silence. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind us, sealing out the whispers of the entire forensic department. Marcus walked behind his massive desk and crossed his arms. "You are the best forensic accountant I have ever hired, Olivia." Marcus said, his voice dropping into a harsh, pragmatic register. "You have a lethal instinct for financial dismantling, but you just brought a federal raid, a panicked felon, and a screaming mother into the middle of my firm. You are a massive liability to me right this second." "I understand, Marcus," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "Hand over your badge and your access tokens," he demanded, holding out his hand. "You are on mandatory administrative leave effective immediately. 2 weeks fully paid. Go handle this spectacular mess. When the FBI and the SEC are done scraping your brother off the pavement, and when your husband is behind bars, you can come back. Until then, you are locked out of the system. I cannot have an active victim of wire fraud handling federal investigations." I unclipped my heavy metal Vanguard badge and placed it on his desk right next to my encrypted access fob. It was a tactical necessity, and we both knew it. I nodded once, turned on my heel, and walked out of the building. The cold Seattle air bit at my face as I walked 3 blocks down the street to a high-end, dimly lit espresso bar. The adrenaline of the morning confrontation was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, calculating focus. I needed to map out my next move. I ordered a black coffee, took a seat in a secluded leather booth at the very back of the cafe, and opened my personal laptop. I needed to verify that the family court protective order had successfully isolated my children. Before I could even type my password, a shadow fell across my table. I looked up. Jasmine, Derek's wife, was standing there. She wore a razor-sharp, tailored trench coat, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She did not look like the weeping, betrayed spouse of a collapsed fraudster. She looked like a predator who had just finished a very satisfying hunt. She held a thick, unmarked manila folder tightly against her chest. "I am not here to defend him, Olivia," Jasmine said, reading the immediate icy suspicion in my eyes. "I am here to bury him. May I sit down?" I gestured to the empty leather seat across from me. Jasmine slid into the booth, placing the thick folder squarely in the center of the wooden table. She did not order a drink. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper that barely carried over the ambient noise of the coffee shop espresso machines. "Your family is in a state of absolute, unprecedented panic." Jasmine began, her eyes locking onto mine. "David is locked out of every single financial institution in the state. Derek is hiding in a hotel room waiting for the FBI to kick the door off its hinges. But William and Catherine are not giving up. They spent the last hour in my living room drafting a new strategy to destroy you. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, feeling the bitter heat slide down my throat. What is the plan? I asked, my voice completely devoid of fear. They are filing an emergency medical petition. Jasmine stated, her tone turning incredibly serious. They are utilizing the public scene you all just caused at Vanguard. Catherine is submitting a sworn affidavit claiming you have suffered a severe violent psychotic break due to the stress of your marriage. David is co-signing the petition. They are calling a private, highly unethical psychiatrist on their payroll to authorize a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. I set my coffee cup down. The sheer terrifying audacity of the maneuver was staggering. If they get you committed even temporarily, David will invoke his emergency spousal rights to gain medical and legal power of attorney. Jasmine explained, tracing the edge of the manila folder with her manicured fingernail. He will use that power of attorney to override your bank freeze. He will unlock the accounts, drain the remaining equity, wire the cash to an offshore shell company, and flee the country with Derek before the SEC can issue an international warrant. They are trying to lock you in a padded room so they can pick your bones clean. They are truly desperate. I noted a cold, calculating anger burning in my chest. But why are you telling me this, Jasmine? You are married to the architect of this entire disaster. Jasmine let out a sharp, humorless laugh. I was married to him, she corrected smoothly. I knew Derek was bleeding capital 6 months ago. He became sloppy. He started taking business calls in the garage and hiding his secondary phones. Unlike your mother, I do not tolerate being treated like an accessory. I hired my own forensic accountant. I saw the massive gaping holes in his ledger long before the SEC did. She tapped the manila folder. For the past 30 days, I have been systematically dismantling my legal ties to your brother. Jasmine revealed, her eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. I liquidated every single clean, legally protected asset that belonged to me. I sold my inherited properties. I cashed out my independent stock portfolios. I took every dollar that the federal government cannot seize, and I transferred it into a highly aggressive, irrevocable offshore trust. Derek cannot touch it. The FBI cannot touch it. Your brother is completely broke and he does not even know it yet. I leaned back in the leather booth, looking at my sister-in-law with a profound, newfound respect. We were two women raised in proximity to absolute toxicity, and we had both chosen to burn the house down rather than burn with it. I am leaving him today, Jasmine stated firmly. But before I disappear, you need to see this. She opened the manila folder and slid a single glossy piece of paper across the dark wooden table. It was not a bank statement. It was not a legal brief. It was a medical ultrasound printout. I stared at the black and white image of a tiny developing fetus. I looked up at Jasmine, my mind rapidly processing the implications. Derek is sterile, I said, stating a known family medical fact. Jasmine smiled, a cold, vicious expression that sent a chill through the warm cafe. He is, she confirmed softly. But his 24-year-old secretary is currently 4 months pregnant with her personal trainer's child. Derek, however, is entirely convinced the baby is his. He thinks it is a medical miracle. He thinks he is finally proving his manhood to your father. Jasmine leaned closer, pressing her finger directly onto the ultrasound image. Do you want to know the ultimate punchline, Olivia? She whispered. That $300,000 David stole from your house equity. It was never going into Nexus Tech to save the company. Derek was using your stolen money to secretly buy a cash-only 4-bedroom house in Mercer Island for his secretary and her fake baby. He was robbing you to fund his delusion. I stared at the ultrasound photo, the sheer pathetic reality of my brother's existence snapping into perfect clarity. Jasmine gathered her tailored designer coat, gave me a single approving nod, and walked out of the cafe to execute her final vanishing act. I was left alone in the leather booth with the ultimate weapon sitting right in front of my coffee cup. I did not immediately go to the police. I had one more piece of personal business to completely dismantle. I pulled out my phone and drafted a text message to David. I gave him an address in the industrial district near the Seattle shipyards and told him to meet me at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. The location I chose was a massive abandoned maritime warehouse. Vanguard Financial Forensics had seized the commercial property during a corporate liquidation 2 months ago, and I still possessed the digital access codes. It was cavernous freezing and completely isolated from the city. The thick air smelled heavily of rusted iron and salt water. I stood beneath a single harsh halogen light suspended from the towering steel rafters, waiting in the absolute silence. Promptly at 6, the heavy corrugated metal doors groaned open. David stepped inside. He was wearing his tailored camel hair overcoat, desperately attempting to project the image of a successful, untouchable corporate executive. He walked across the cracked concrete floor, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly in the empty expanse. Despite the fact that his bank accounts were entirely frozen, and he had been physically dragged out of my office building by security guards just hours earlier, he still wore an expression of smug, insufferable arrogance. He genuinely believed he had the upper hand because he had successfully poisoned my children against me. He stopped a few feet away from the rusted steel shipping crate I was using as a makeshift table. He looked around the desolate, echoing warehouse and sneered. "Are you planning to apologize to me in secret so your coworkers do not see you beg?" David asked, his voice dripping with intense condescension. "My mother called me. She said Marcus suspended you. It looks like your little power trip blew up right in your face, Olivia. You have no job, you have no kids, and you are entirely alone." I did not speak. I simply stood with my hands in my pockets and watched him perform. "I am willing to be reasonable." David continued adjusting the collar of his coat with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrists. "If you call Pacific Century Bank right now, withdraw the fraud complaint, and tell the federal investigators that the mortgage document was simply a marital misunderstanding, I will consider letting you come back home. You unlock my accounts, you stop this psychotic vendetta against your brother, and I will tell Ethan and Mia that you are seeking mental health treatment. That is my final offer. Take it, or I will make sure you never see them again." He stood there, puffing out his chest, waiting for my absolute surrender. He expected me to cry. He expected me to break down and negotiate under the terrifying threat of losing my children. Instead, I reached into the heavy manila folder Jasmine had given me. I pulled out a thick stack of high-resolution surveillance photographs and forensic banking ledgers. I tossed them onto the rusted steel crate between us. They landed with a heavy, definitive smack. "Pick those up," I commanded, my voice echoing off the concrete walls, devoid of any warmth or mercy. David frowned, his arrogant mask slipping slightly. He looked down at the documents, hesitated, and then reached out to pick up the top photograph. It was a crystal-clear image of Derek walking out of a high-end maternity clinic, his arm wrapped affectionately around the waist of a beautiful 24-year-old blonde woman. The next photo showed the two of them kissing outside a luxury furniture store. "That is Chloe," I stated clinically. "Derek's executive assistant. She is currently 4 months pregnant. Derek actually believes the child is his, which is medically hilarious considering his documented sterility. But that is not the part that concerns you, David. Look at the next document." David's hands began to tremble slightly as he moved the photos aside to reveal a finalized real estate contract. "That is a property deed for a beautiful 4-bedroom house on Mercer Island." I explained, my tone surgical and precise. "It was purchased in cash exactly 48 hours ago. The deed is registered entirely under Chloe's name. It is a hidden love nest for your brother-in-law and his pregnant mistress. Now I want you to look at the highlighted financial transfers on the second page." David stared at the highlighted numbers. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His breathing hitched, his eyes darting frantically across the black ink. "You thought the $300,000 you stole from my home equity was the only thing funding Derek's lavish lifestyle," I said, circling the steel crate like a predator evaluating its trapped prey. "But Derek is a black hole. He needed more liquid cash to close the deal on that house. So he asked you for an additional contribution. He told you it was for a limited time stock buy-in, did he not? He told you that you were buying exclusive founder shares in Nexus Tech so you could finally be part of his elite boys club." David's eyes were wide fixed on the exact dollar amount printed on the escrow wire transfer receipt. $80,000. I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, cutting whisper. The exact amount you quietly withdrew from Ethan and Mia's private school tuition funds and their college savings accounts 3 days ago. I tracked the routing numbers this afternoon. You wired $80,000 of our children's money directly into a Delaware shell company controlled by Derek. Derek then immediately transferred that exact $80,000 to the Mercer Island escrow account to cover the final closing costs for his mistress. You handed over the money meant for your daughter's education so your brother-in-law could buy premium Italian leather sofas for a 24-year-old girl who is sleeping with her personal trainer. David's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the rusted shipping crate to keep himself from collapsing onto the freezing concrete floor. The papers shook violently in his hands. He stared at the signature on the deed, realizing the absolute catastrophic reality of his situation. He had idolized Derek. He had worshipped his charismatic, wealthy brother-in-law. He had betrayed me, committed federal bank fraud, and actively brainwashed his own children just to earn a seat at Derek's table. And Derek had played him for an absolute fool. Impossible. David choked out. His voice was a pathetic, broken wheeze. He could barely force the words past his trembling lips. He said this money was to buy shares. He promised me equity. He said we were going to be partners. I laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that pierced the freezing warehouse air. You sold your children's future in exchange for fake respect from a con artist, I replied. David stared at the documents, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The illusion of his elite corporate brotherhood shattered into a million jagged pieces. He dropped the papers onto the rusted steel crate as if they were physically burning him. Without another word, he spun around and sprinted toward the heavy metal doors. He did not care about looking composed anymore. He ran like a man whose entire life was on fire. I picked up the manila folder, slid the documents safely inside, and walked out of the warehouse at a measured, deliberate pace. I stepped into my car, started the engine, and followed the erratic red taillights of David's sedan. I knew exactly where he was going. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the manicured driveway of Derek's massive suburban rental home. David slammed his car into park, practically leaping out before the engine even cut off. He stormed up the pristine brick walkway and began pounding his fists against the heavy oak front door. He did not wait for anyone to answer. He turned the handle, shoved the door open with his shoulder, and barged inside. I parked neatly by the curb, grabbed my folder, and walked through the front door right behind him. The inside of Derek's house was in a state of absolute chaos. Designer suitcases were half-packed on the living room floor. Framed photographs were scattered across the expensive leather sofas. Derek was standing near the marble kitchen island, holding a stack of legal documents and sweating profusely. When David stormed into the room, Derek physically flinched, stepping back until his spine hit the custom cabinetry. "Where is my money?" David roared, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. He crossed the living room in 3 massive strides, grabbing Derek by the lapels of his wrinkled designer shirt. "You told me we were partners. You took $80,000 from my children to buy a house for your pregnant secretary. Give it back to me right now." Derek tried to shove David away, but panic had given my husband a desperate manic strength. Derek sputtered, his eyes darting frantically toward the hallway. "Let go of me, David!" Derek shouted, trying to pry David's fingers off his shirt. "It is a temporary cash flow issue. It was a strategic corporate acquisition. You do not understand high-level real estate investment." Before David could throw a punch, the heavy oak doors of the formal dining room swung open. My parents, William and Catherine, rushed into the kitchen. They had clearly rushed straight to Derek's house after Marcus threw them out of my office building. When William saw David pinning his golden boy against the cabinets, his face contorted into a mask of absolute outrage. "Get your hands off my son!" William bellowed, marching forward and violently shoving David away from Derek. "Have you lost your mind? Are you trying to physically assault him in his own home?" "He stole from me!" David screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Derek, who was hastily straightening his collar. "He forged my wife's signature to take $300,000 out of my house, and then he conned me into draining my own kids' college funds. He is a fraud. He bought a luxury house for his 24-year-old mistress. I stood silently in the arched doorway of the kitchen, watching the entire pathetic spectacle unfold. I expected my parents to at least show a sliver of shock. I expected them to demand an explanation from Derek. But I had vastly underestimated their toxic, blinding devotion to their son. Catherine stepped protectively in front of Derek, glaring at David with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. That house was purchased as a corporate asset for Nexus Tech, Catherine declared, reciting whatever desperate lie Derek had just fed her moments before we arrived. It is a business investment. Derek is a visionary. He has to make bold financial moves to secure the company's future. David stared at my mother, his jaw completely slack. A corporate asset. He repeated, his voice hollow. She is his secretary. She is carrying another man's child, and he bought her a house with my money. You are just a son-in-law. William spat out, his voice laced with heavy, venomous contempt. You do not dictate how my son runs his corporate empire. You gave Derek that $80,000 entirely voluntarily. Nobody forced you to wire those funds. You made an investment, and investments carry risk. Do not come crying to us just because you lack the stomach for high-stakes business. You should be grateful Derek even allowed you to participate. The sheer delusion in my father's voice hung heavy in the air. David looked at William, then at Catherine, and finally at Derek, who was now smirking safely behind his parents' backs. In that singular, devastating moment, the truth finally pierced through David's impenetrable arrogance. He realized he was never part of their elite inner circle. He was never respected. He was never family. To William, Catherine, and Derek, David was nothing more than an expendable wallet. He was a pawn they had eagerly sacrificed to keep their golden boy afloat for a few more weeks. David physically stumbled backward, the reality of his total financial and social ruin crushing him. He turned around, his eyes desperately scanning the room until they locked onto me standing quietly in the doorway. All of the condescension, all of the smug superiority he had wielded at the warehouse was entirely gone. He looked like a terrified, broken child. He took slow, trembling steps toward me, raising his hands in a gesture of pure surrender. "Olivia!" David whispered, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "Olivia, please. You have to help me. You have to fix this. You know how to trace the money. You can call the federal investigators. Tell them I was tricked. Tell them I did not know what Derek was doing. We can get the house back. We can start over. Please, I will do anything you want." He reached out to grab my hands, his eyes begging for the forgiveness and salvation I used to offer him so freely. I did not step back. I simply raised my right arm and firmly, cleanly brushed his trembling hands away. My expression remained as hard and cold as carved marble. "I filed the divorce papers this morning." I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the dead silence of the kitchen, "and I submitted a vast amount of evidence regarding your financial negligence and your involvement in Derek's fraudulent wire transfers to the family court judge." David stopped breathing. His hands dropped to his sides. "Those papers include an emergency zero-tolerance protective order," I continued mercilessly. "You are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my children. If you attempt to contact Ethan or Mia, or if you even drive past their school, you will be arrested instantly. You wanted to play high-stakes business, David. Now you can pay the price." David crumpled to the pristine kitchen floor, his expensive camel hair overcoat pooling around him like a discarded rag. He reached out his hand, grasping at the empty air, as a ragged, pathetic sob tore from his throat. William and Catherine stood paralyzed, their faces entirely drained of color. They were finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of the legal and financial avalanche I had just triggered. Even Derek had stopped smirking. He stared at me, his eyes wide with dawn terror, realizing I was not just destroying David. I was dismantling his entire fraudulent empire piece by piece. I did not stay to watch them mourn the sudden death of their delusions. I turned on my heel, walked out the front door, and drove away without a single backward glance. My phone buzzed relentlessly on the passenger seat as I navigated the slick Seattle highways. It was Marcus. I ignored the first 3 calls, assuming he was calling to enforce the strict terms of my administrative leave. When he called a 4th time, I finally pressed the answer button on my steering wheel console, keeping my eyes fixed on the gray road ahead. "Get back to the office right now!" Marcus ordered, his voice clipped and vibrating with a rare, highly controlled energy. "You suspended me, Marcus," I reminded him coldly. "You took my badge. I reinstated you 10 minutes ago." He shot back without missing a beat. "The encrypted files you forwarded to my secure server before confronting your husband just triggered a massive federal chain reaction. Bypass the main lobby. Take the private executive elevator directly to the secure briefing room on the 42nd floor. We have guests." The line went dead. I pressed my foot down heavily on the accelerator. When I walked into the secure, soundproof, glass-walled conference room at Vanguard Financial Forensics, the atmosphere was thick with high-stakes tension. Marcus was standing at the head of the heavy mahogany table. Beside him stood 2 men and 1 woman wearing dark, impeccably tailored suits. Their FBI and SEC badges lay completely visible on the polished wood. "Take a seat, Olivia," Marcus instructed, gesturing to the empty leather chair directly across from the federal agents. The lead FBI agent, a tall, severe-looking man named Harrison, pushed a thick stack of printed financial charts toward me. "You handed us the key to dismantle Nexus Tech." Harrison began, his tone strictly business. "The offshore transfers initiated by your sister-in-law, combined with the stolen equity trails from your husband, paint a very clear picture of a collapsing Ponzi scheme. We have successfully frozen every known digital asset tied to your brother." "Then arrest him," I said, flatly, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. "You have the wire fraud evidence. You have David's signature on the forged mortgage documents." "It is not that simple," the female SEC agent interjected, leaning forward and folding her hands. "Derek is a highly sophisticated grifter. He systematically scrubbed his primary servers. The digital trails prove he moved money, but they do not prove the original source of the defrauded investor capital. Defense attorneys would tear holes in a purely circumstantial digital trail. We need the foundational architecture of the scam to secure a federal indictment that sticks. We need his physical ledger." I leaned back in my chair, my forensic instincts immediately kicking into high gear. "Derek is arrogant, but he is not stupid," I analyzed aloud. "He would never keep a physical record of his crimes in his own home, and he certainly would not leave it at the Nexus Tech headquarters where disgruntled employees could find it." "We know," Agent Harrison replied, tapping a high-resolution photograph on the table. It was an aerial surveillance shot of my parents' sprawling suburban estate. "He kept it somewhere he believed federal agents would never have probable cause to search," Harrison explained. "He hid it inside his parents' house. Specifically, our informants indicate the burn book is locked inside the biometric wall safe, hidden behind the oil portrait in your father's private study." I stared at the photograph. The sheer parasitic entitlement of my brother made my blood run cold. He was using our parents' home as a federal evidence vault, putting them directly in the crosshairs of a major criminal investigation just to protect his own skin. "So get a search warrant," I stated, looking up at Harrison. "Raid the estate. A federal judge denied the warrant 20 minutes ago." Harrison explained, his jaw tightening with visible frustration. "We do not have sufficient probable cause to raid William and Catherine's primary residence based solely on the financial movements of their son. If we try to push it through the appellate courts, the delay will trigger an alert in the system. Derek will be tipped off. He will contact your parents, and that ledger will be burning in their stone fireplace before we even pull into their long driveway. If we do not secure that ledger within the next 24 hours, Derek will board a private charter out of the country," Marcus added, crossing his arms over his chest. "He knows the walls are closing in rapidly. He is currently scrambling to secure emergency cash. Once he fully processes that David is entirely broke and cut off from your equity, Derek will run, and the money will vanish with him." The room fell dead silent. The federal agents looked at me, their expressions a complex mixture of professional expectation and desperate necessity. They could not legally enter the house. They could not force the safe open without a federal warrant. Their hands were completely tied by the law. But I was not a federal agent. I was a family member. I looked down at the aerial photograph of my childhood home. A slow, chilling realization washed over me as I glanced at the date displayed on my smartwatch. The timing was absolutely perfect. It was almost poetic. "You do not need a search warrant," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the conference room like a scalpel. Agent Harrison raised an eyebrow, exchanging a quick glance with his SEC counterpart. "Excuse me. Tonight is my parents' 40th wedding anniversary," I explained, looking directly at Marcus. "They are hosting a massive catered gala at their estate. There will be over 200 wealthy guests, a live band, and valet parking. The entire house will be unlocked and completely chaotic. William and Catherine will be entirely focused on projecting their perfect wealthy family image to their country club friends." Marcus leaned forward, his sharp mind catching onto my strategy instantly. "You have the access codes to that biometric safe. It is an older model," I replied, my mind already calculating the infiltration route. "My father never updated the master override code I installed for him 5 years ago when I set up his estate planning. He relies entirely on the fingerprint scanner, but the manual override sequence is still active." I stood up from the leather chair, buttoning my suit jacket with absolute lethal precision. I looked at the federal agents, feeling the final traces of daughterly obligation vanish entirely from my system. Derek thinks I am busy dealing with a messy divorce. My parents think I am professionally ruined and publicly disgraced. I stated, a cold, merciless smile touching my lips. "I will walk right through their front door smile for the cameras and hand you that ledger tonight." The sprawling estate in Mercer Island was illuminated like a beacon of old money and false prestige. Valets scrambled to park a continuous stream of luxury vehicles along the circular driveway. I handed my keys to a young attendant and walked up the sweeping stone staircase. I wore a floor-length emerald green silk gown that cost more than Derek's first car. My hair was perfectly swept back, my makeup sharp and immaculate. I was not the hysterical, defeated woman my family expected to hide in shame. I was a loaded weapon walking directly into their celebration. I pushed open the massive double doors. A live string quartet was playing in the grand foyer. 200 of Seattle's elite milled about, holding crystal champagne flutes and wearing their finest diamonds. When I stepped into the light, the chatter near the entrance died instantly. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the affluent crowd. My family had undoubtedly spent the last 24 hours spinning a narrative of my mental collapse and marital failure, yet here I stood, radiating absolute untouchable authority. Before I could even reach for a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, a hand clamped down on my wrist like a vice. Catherine's perfectly manicured fingers dug into my skin. She wore a suffocating amount of jewelry, her face stretched into a rigid, terrifying smile for the onlookers as she forcefully dragged me behind a towering floral arrangement in the secluded alcove. "What are you doing here?" Catherine hissed, her voice vibrating with suppressed venomous rage. "David just called us. He told us you filed for divorce this morning and slapped him with a restraining order. You absolute fool! You are humiliating this family in front of the entire country club board." I looked down at her hand, gripping my wrist, then back up to her panicked, furious eyes. "Let go of me, Catherine," I said, my voice completely flat and deadly calm. She flinched instinctively, dropping her hand as if the silk of my dress had burned her. "You are ruining everything," she whispered, frantically, aggressively adjusting her pearl necklace to calm herself. "Derek is under immense corporate pressure. David is locked out of his accounts because of your psychotic stunt. And now you show up to my anniversary gala, trying to make a scene. Get out. Go back to whatever cheap motel you are staying in and fix your marriage before you embarrass us any further." "I am going to get a drink," I replied, stepping around her without a single ounce of hesitation. "Enjoy your party, Mother. It is going to be a very memorable night." I left her fuming in the shadows and slipped seamlessly into the crowd. I smiled at a few familiar faces, exchanging empty pleasantries with my father's banking colleagues, just long enough to establish my presence and appear completely unbothered. I kept moving slowly, drifting toward the grand staircase at the back of the foyer. The moment Catherine was cornered by the mayor's wife, and William was busy boasting to a group of real estate investors near the patio doors, I stepped out of the light and moved upstairs. The second floor of the estate was dark and eerily quiet, heavily insulated from the loud jazz music playing below. I walked down the carpeted hallway, my steps completely silent, until I reached the heavy mahogany doors of William's private study. I slipped inside and locked the door behind me. The moonlight filtered through the large bay windows, illuminating the massive oil portrait of my grandfather, hanging directly behind the executive desk. I did not waste a single second. I walked behind the desk, reached behind the heavy gilded frame, and pulled hard. It swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing the matte black steel of the biometric wall safe. The red scanner blinked in the darkness, waiting for William's fingerprint. I ignored it. I flipped open the tiny concealed digital keypad hidden beneath the biometric glass. My fingers flew across the keys, inputting the 14-digit master override sequence I had programmed 5 years ago when I organized his estate taxes. The internal mechanism clicked heavily. The thick steel door popped open. Inside, sitting right on top of velvet-lined jewelry boxes, stacks of bearer bonds and emergency cash, was a thick black leather-bound notebook. Derek's physical ledger, the holy grail of his entire Ponzi scheme. The single piece of physical evidence the FBI and the SEC needed to authorize a federal raid. I pulled the heavy book out and laid it flat on my father's pristine desk. I pulled out my phone, activated the document scanner application, and opened the cover. The pages were filled with Derek's chaotic handwritten notes. It was a masterpiece of corporate fraud. He had listed offshore routing numbers in the Cayman Islands, fake investor profiles, encrypted passwords for the shell companies, and the exact paper trail of the millions he had stolen. Right there on page 42 was the explicit record of the $300,000 David had stolen from our home equity, mapped out next to the down payment for his mistress's Mercer Island house. I began photographing the pages rapidly. The bright flash of my camera illuminated the dark study like brief strikes of lightning. 10 pages, 20 pages, 30 pages. I captured the undeniable architecture of his fraud with perfect clarity. The federal agents waiting at Vanguard now had exactly what they needed to lock my brother away for decades. I closed the ledger, my heart pounding with a cold, triumphant rhythm, and reached out to put the book back into the safe to cover my tracks. Then the heavy brass handle of the study door turned. The deadbolt I had engaged clicked loudly as someone shoved a master key into the cylinder. The massive mahogany doors flew open with brutal force, slamming hard against the interior walls. I turned around, the black ledger still clutched in my hands. Derek was standing in the doorway. He was not wearing a tailored tuxedo for the anniversary gala. He was wearing dark, nondescript clothes, a heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His face was ghostly pale, slick with panicked sweat, and his eyes were wide with cornered, feral desperation. And resting firmly in his hands, gripped with white knuckles and leveled directly at my chest, was my father's custom sporting rifle. The barrel of the rifle did not waver. Derek stood in the doorway, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. His eyes were completely bloodshot, wild with the cornered panic of an animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. He looked nothing like the polished, untouchable corporate visionary he pretended to be downstairs. He looked like a man drowning in his own catastrophic lies. "You were always jealous of me." Derek spat, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and terror. "You have spent your entire life trying to tear me down because you could never accept that I am the one they actually love. You want to see me in a federal prison, do you not? You want to ruin everything." I stared down the dark steel barrel of my father's rifle. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a primal survival instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced my posture to remain perfectly rigid. I kept my face utterly devoid of fear. I slowly lowered my hands, letting them rest casually at my sides. As I did, my index finger brushed against the digital crown of my Apple Watch, silently activating the high-definition voice recorder. I had 45 minutes of battery life. I only needed 5. "Put the gun down, Derek," I said, my voice projecting a surgical, icy calm. "You are holding a firearm registered to William in the middle of a crowded gala." You are not a killer. You are just a fraud. Do not upgrade your federal indictment from wire fraud to murder. He stepped into the study, kicking the heavy mahogany doors shut behind him with the heel of his expensive shoe. The lock clicked, sealing us inside. You think you are so brilliant, Olivia, Derek sneered, taking a slow step toward me. You think finding that ledger changes anything. I am 10 steps ahead of you. I am 10 steps ahead of the SEC, the FBI, and every pathetic investor who handed me their money. You think a few photographs will bring down Nexus Tech. You have no idea how deep this runs. I tilted my head, feigning a look of mild amusement. I leaned back against the edge of the mahogany desk, crossing my arms to signal absolute control. I know exactly how deep it runs. I countered smoothly, baiting his massive, fragile ego. I know you use Delaware shell companies to funnel imaginary returns to your early investors. I know you stole David's equity to buy a house for your pregnant secretary because your cash flow dried up. You are bankrupt, Derek. You are scrambling for loose change like a desperate addict. It is over. His face flushed a violent, angry red. He gripped the rifle tighter, stepping further into the moonlight filtering through the bay windows. I am not bankrupt, he roared, spit flying from his lips. I manage over $80 million in decentralized offshore assets. The Cayman routing numbers in that book are just the holding accounts. The real money is untouchable. I built a financial network so complex the federal government cannot even trace the IP addresses. I orchestrated the greatest transfer of wealth this city has ever seen, and I did it right under the noses of Seattle's wealthiest idiots. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on his, ensuring the microphone caught every single syllable of his arrogant confession. He was unraveling, desperate to prove his superiority even as his empire burned. It is impressive. I admitted, my tone dripping with calculated mock admiration. I will give you that. Conning David was easy. He is a desperate social climber. But pulling the wool over William and Catherine's eyes, that must have taken real skill. They actually believe you are a visionary. They actually think Nexus Tech is a legitimate corporate entity. It is almost tragic how easily you manipulated our own parents. Derek stopped. A harsh, chilling laugh erupted from his throat. The sound was entirely devoid of sanity. He lowered the rifle an inch, amused by my apparent ignorance. Manipulated them, he mocked, shaking his head. You really are clueless, Olivia. You think William and Catherine are innocent victims in this. You think they are just proud parents standing by their successful son. My stomach plummeted, a cold dread pooling in my veins. What are you talking about? I demanded, my voice dropping its manufactured calm. Derek smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression spreading across his sweating face. They knew, Olivia. They knew from day one. Who do you think introduced me to the country club board? Who do you think hosted the private charity dinners to bring in high net worth targets? Catherine used her philanthropy galas to launder the initial seed money. William personally signed off on the fraudulent property appraisals using his banking credentials to legitimize my shell companies. The words slammed into me with devastating force. My parents were not just turning a blind eye to Derek's massive financial crimes. They were active co-conspirators. They had actively participated in defrauding hundreds of people, actively shielded his criminal enterprise, and actively chosen to protect his wealth over any semblance of morality or the law. They helped you. I whispered, the sickening reality settling over me. They did not just help me, Derek sneered, raising the rifle back up to my chest. They took a 20% cut of every single fraudulent transaction. That pristine estate you are standing in right now is paid for by the victims of Nexus Tech. You thought you were going to walk out of here and destroy me, but if I go down, William and Catherine go down with me. You will be sending your own parents to a federal penitentiary. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my entire body. I did not feel sorrow for my parents. I did not feel torn. I felt purely vindicated. The recording on my wrist was capturing the definitive downfall of my entire toxic family. They deserved to burn right alongside you. I stated, my voice echoing with finality. And thanks to this conversation, they will. Derek's eyes narrowed. He looked at my crossed arms, tracing my posture, and then his gaze snapped to the glowing red recording indicator on my Apple Watch. The triumphant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by pure murderous rage. "Give me the watch," Derek commanded, taking a fast, aggressive step forward. "Give me the watch and the phone, Olivia, right now." I stood my ground, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "No." Derek racked the bolt of the rifle. The sharp mechanical clack echoed deafeningly in the silent study. I said, "Give me the watch." He screamed, his fingers slipping directly onto the trigger. Before I could even brace myself, the heavy mahogany doors behind Derek swung open with a silent, ghostly speed. A tall figure stepped rapidly out of the dark hallway shadows. Jasmine did not say a word. She moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency. She reached out and grabbed a solid, heavy bronze sculpture of a rearing horse, resting on the antique bookshelf near the door. With one fluid, brutal motion, she swung the heavy bronze statue downward, slamming it directly into Derek's right shoulder. A sickening crack echoed through the room. Derek shrieked in absolute agony. His shoulder buckled instantly, his fingers spasming violently. The custom sporting rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering heavily onto the hardwood floor and sliding out of reach beneath a leather armchair. Derek collapsed onto his knees, clutching his shattered arm and howling in pain. Jasmine did not hesitate. She dropped the bloodied bronze statue, grabbed my arm with a grip like steel, and hauled me toward the open doorway. "Run, Olivia," Jasmine shouted, shoving me into the hallway. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I bolted into the dimly lit hallway, my emerald silk gown twisting around my legs as I sprinted toward the grand staircase. Jasmine was right behind me, her breathing steady and focused, acting as a flawless rearguard. Behind us, the muffled, agonizing screams of my brother echoed from the study. He was entirely incapacitated, rolling on the expensive Persian rug while clutching his shattered shoulder. The heavy bronze horse had done its job perfectly. We reached the top of the sweeping marble staircase. Below us, the anniversary gala was still in full swing. The string quartet was playing a lively classical piece, and 200 members of Seattle's elite were clinking crystal champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the violent federal crime scene that had just unfolded directly above their heads. I gripped the polished wooden banister and descended the stairs rapidly, my head held high. Jasmine flanked me, her sharp eyes scanning the foyer for any signs of interference. When we hit the ground floor, my sudden rushed appearance drew immediate attention. Conversations halted. The wealthy guests turned their heads, their diamond earrings catching the light as they stared at my disheveled hair and the intense, unapologetic expression on my face. They parted like the Red Sea, clearing a direct path for us toward the massive double doors of the front entrance. I tightened my grip on my phone. The digital scans of Derek's burn book were already securely uploaded to the federal server at Vanguard. The evidence was locked in. As we pushed through the heavy oak doors and burst out into the cool, crisp night air, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the ambient noise of the party. It was faint at first, echoing up from the winding roads at the base of the Mercer Island hills. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and amplified. The distinct, terrifying wail of multiple police sirens ripped through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. I had not walked into this house blindly. Before stepping out of my car earlier that evening, I had engaged a dead man switch protocol on my encrypted device, linked directly to Marcus and Agent Harrison. They had strategically positioned local law enforcement and federal tactical units at the bottom of the hill, waiting for my signal. The moment my watch finished uploading the photographs of the ledger, the extraction order was automatically triggered. The sirens grew deafeningly loud. The valets standing in the circular driveway froze in absolute confusion, dropping the keys to luxury sedans as the noise bounced off the manicured hedges. Suddenly, the front doors of the estate flew open violently behind us. William and Catherine charged out onto the stone portico. They had clearly heard Derek's screams of agony from the second floor and rushed to investigate, only to find the safe hanging wide open and their son writhing on the floor. My father's face was an unnatural shade of crimson, his fists clenched at his sides. My mother looked entirely deranged. Her perfect socialite mask had been ripped away, leaving behind a frantic, vicious desperation. Catherine spotted us standing at the edge of the driveway. Her eyes locked onto Jasmine, and a lifetime of thinly veiled prejudice and deep-seated hatred finally boiled to the surface. She marched down the stone steps, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my former sister-in-law. "You!" Catherine shrieked, her voice cracking with pure venom, entirely ignoring the wealthy guests who were now spilling out onto the porch to watch the spectacle. "You ungrateful, home-wrecking parasite, you planned this. You have been a cancer on this family since the day you arrived. You manipulated my daughter, you assaulted my son, and you are trying to destroy everything we have built. You belong in the gutter." Jasmine did not flinch. She did not back down. She stood her ground on the pristine cobblestone driveway, her posture radiating absolute unbreakable strength. She let Catherine finish her vile, hysterical rant. Then, with a speed and precision that left the entire crowd gasping in shock, Jasmine stepped forward and slapped Catherine hard across the face. The sound of the impact echoed sharply over the wailing sirens. Catherine stumbled backward, clutching her cheek in pure, unadulterated disbelief. Her expensive pearl necklace swung wildly against her chest. William lunged forward to intervene, but Jasmine leveled a glare at him so utterly terrifying that he froze dead in his tracks. "You are the real monster here," Jasmine declared, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear authority. "I am not the one destroying this family. You are a parasite sucking the blood out of your own children to fund your pathetic, delusional vanity. You protected a criminal, you enabled a fraud, and you sold your own soul for a country club membership. Do not ever speak to me again." Before Catherine could even attempt to recover from the physical and verbal blow, the driveway was flooded with blinding, chaotic light. A convoy of local police cruisers and unmarked black federal SUVs tore up the winding driveway. Tires screeched against the cobblestones as the vehicles swerved aggressively, cutting off every single exit and boxing in the valet stand. Red and blue emergency lights washed over the sprawling estate, illuminating the terrified faces of Seattle's elite. Heavily armed tactical officers poured out of the cruisers, immediately securing the perimeter. Agent Harrison and the female SEC investigator stepped out of the lead SUV. They wore dark tactical jackets over their suits, their federal badges shining brightly under the harsh police spotlights. I expected them to rush past us, storm up the stairs, and drag Derek out of the house in heavy steel handcuffs. I expected them to execute a standard dramatic arrest. But Harrison did not pull his weapon. He did not issue orders to breach the house. Instead, he walked calmly and deliberately up the stone steps, stopping directly in front of William, Catherine, and Derek, who was now stumbling out the front door, clutching his ruined, bleeding shoulder. The guests watched in absolute horrified silence. Harrison reached into his jacket pocket. He did not pull out a pair of handcuffs. He pulled out 3 thick, heavily sealed legal envelopes. He handed one to my father, one to my mother, and dropped the third at Derek's feet. "We are not arresting you tonight, Derek," Agent Harrison stated, his voice booming with undeniable federal authority. "The United States government is officially subpoenaing every single member of this household. You are all subjects of a massive multi-agency federal racketeering and conspiracy investigation. Do not attempt to leave the state. We will see you in federal court." The blinding fluorescent lights of the Seattle FBI field office were a harsh contrast to the warm, ambient glow of the Mercer Island estate. We sat inside Interrogation Room B, a cramped windowless box lined with gray acoustic panels and a heavily smudged two-way mirror. The air conditioning hummed with a monotonous freezing drone. The United States government had not waited for a polite court date. Following the initial service of the subpoenas at the gala, Agent Harrison had ordered them brought in for an immediate formal deposition. Across the battered steel table sat the remnants of the Wilson family dynasty. Derek slumped in the middle chair. His right arm was strapped firmly to his chest in a thick medical sling, his skin possessing a sickly, translucent pallor from the painkillers the paramedics had administered. William sat to his left, staring blankly at the scratched metal surface of the table. Catherine sat on the right, still wearing her emerald silk gala dress. She aggressively adjusted her designer shawl, attempting to project an aura of untouchable superiority in a room specifically designed to strip it away. I sat directly across from them, flanking Agent Harrison. I was not sitting there as a grieving sister or an emotional victim. I sat there in my official capacity as a cooperating forensic accountant for the federal government. Resting squarely on the table between us was the physical evidence of their destruction, the black leather ledger I had pulled from my father's wall safe, alongside a towering stack of printed financial routing documents I had decrypted. Agent Harrison folded his hands over the case file. He looked at the three of them with the cold, detached expression of a predator assessing a trapped meal. We are here to discuss the systematic wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering conspiracy operating under the corporate entity known as Nexus Tech. Agent Harrison stated, his voice flat and clinical. We have the ledger. We have the offshore routing numbers. We have the paper trail. Catherine scoffed. She actually rolled her eyes, leaning back in the uncomfortable metal chair, as if she were dismissing a rude waiter at a country club luncheon. This is an absolute farce, Catherine declared, her tone dripping with arrogant condescension. She looked directly at Agent Harrison, completely ignoring my presence. I do not know what kind of fabricated nonsense my daughter has fed your department, but you are wasting the taxpayers' time. My daughter will withdraw these ridiculous complaints before the sun comes up. She is prone to emotional outbursts. This is nothing more than a private family misunderstanding that has gotten entirely out of hand. We are prominent members of this community. We do not participate in fraud. I stared at the woman who had birthed me. Even now, facing federal agents and a mountain of physical evidence, she truly believed her social status acted as an impenetrable shield. She believed she could simply order me to drop a federal racketeering investigation, just as she used to order me to change my clothes or lower my voice. It is not a family misunderstanding, Catherine, I said, my voice echoing with a calm, surgical precision that made her flinch. You do not get to dictate reality anymore. The federal government does not drop charges just because you find them socially inconvenient. Olivia, stop this nonsense right now, she hissed, leaning forward. You have made your point. You are angry about David and the house. Fine. We will buy you a new house. We will compensate you. Just tell this agent you made a mistake and let us go home. Agent Harrison did not even bother to suppress his grim smile. He turned his head and gave me a slight nod. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I connected it to the digital audio system mounted in the center of the interrogation table. I did not say another word. I simply pressed play. The pristine high-definition audio from the hidden microphone on my Apple Watch filled the small concrete room. Derek's frantic, arrogant voice bounced off the acoustic panels with devastating clarity. The recording played the entire exchange. It played Derek boasting about the offshore holding accounts. It played him mocking the investors. And then the final fatal nail in the coffin echoed through the room. They took a 20% cut of every single fraudulent transaction. Derek's recorded voice sneered. That pristine estate you are standing in right now is paid for by the victims of Nexus Tech. If I go down, William and Catherine go down with me. I hit pause. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. William physically crumbled. The wealthy, imposing banking executive deflated like a punctured tire. All the color drained from his face, leaving behind an ashen, terrifying gray. His breath hitched in his throat, coming out in shallow, panicked gasps. He knew the law. He knew the banking regulations. He knew exactly what a 20% cut of $80 million in stolen assets meant under the RICO Act. Decades of meticulously built corporate reputation, his entire legacy had just been incinerated by a 30-second audio clip. William buried his face in his trembling hands, a low, wretched groan escaping his lips. Catherine sat perfectly rigid. The arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. Her eyes darted wildly from the phone on the table to Agent Harrison and finally to her son. The delusion was shattered. Wealth could not buy her way out of a recorded confession. Derek was sweating profusely. His eyes darted around the concrete room like a trapped rat calculating the dimensions of a cage. He looked at the black ledger sitting in front of me. He looked at the phone. He looked at the devastated, ruined faces of his parents sitting beside him. The survival instinct of a cornered coward kicked in with brutal efficiency. Derek shifted violently in his chair, wincing sharply as the movement jarred his broken shoulder. He did not hesitate. He did not offer a word of apology or solidarity. He raised his good hand and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at his father and mother. It was their idea. Derek shouted, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. He leaned toward Agent Harrison, his eyes wide and pleading. "I was just the face of the company. I was just the pitchman. They orchestrated the entire back end. William provided the fraudulent banking appraisals to make the shell companies look legitimate. Catherine hosted the charity galas specifically to launder the initial seed money through her foundation accounts." "Derek, stop!" William gasped, lifting his head from his hands, his eyes wide with betrayal. "What are you doing?" "I am telling the truth!" Derek screamed back, thoroughly throwing his parents to the wolves to save his own skin. "They took the money. They told me to take David's equity. They told me to leverage Olivia's accounts because they said she was stupid and would never check the internal routing numbers. They orchestrated the entire thing. They are the masterminds. You want the real criminals, Agent Harrison? They are sitting right next to me. I will testify against them. I will give you everything. Just give me immunity." I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I watched the scene unfold with a profound, icy satisfaction. Catherine and William sat paralyzed. They stared at Derek, their beloved golden child, the son they had sacrificed their morals for, the son they had stolen from me to protect, the son they believed could do no wrong. They stared in absolute shattered disbelief as he ruthlessly fed them directly into the jaws of the federal justice system without a single second thought. The massive wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. David walked down the center aisle, adjusting his tailored tie. My former brother-in-law looked completely out of place among the ruined defendants. He had not been arrested during the initial sweep at the gala. He had spent the last 6 months spinning a massive web of lies, positioning himself as the ultimate victim of the Nexus Tech collapse. He had filed for sole custody of the children, claiming my family was a toxic criminal enterprise and that he was the only stable, innocent parent left to protect them. David took the witness stand. He swore the oath, sat down, and immediately adopted an expression of profound sorrow. The defense attorney approached him, feeding him softball questions designed to show how Derek had ruthlessly destroyed everyone around him. David leaned into the microphone. He spoke with a trembling, rehearsed grief. He testified that Derek had abused his trust, secretly leveraging the equity of his family home to float the fraudulent company. He claimed he woke up one morning to find his entire life savings wiped out by a man he trusted implicitly. He painted a picture of a hard-working, honest father whose marriage had been destroyed by the financial strain caused entirely by the Wilson family's greed. He dabbed his eyes, looking pleadingly at the judge, asking for justice so he could rebuild a safe, honest life for his kids. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. The gallery murmured in sympathy. David looked over at me, a brief, smug flash of victory crossing his eyes. He actually believed he had won. He believed he was going to walk out of this courtroom completely free, clutching full custody, ready to move his pregnant mistress into whatever life he could salvage. I did not react. I simply leaned forward and tapped the lead federal prosecutor on the shoulder. I handed him a thin manila folder. The prosecutor stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, took the folder, and walked slowly toward the witness stand. The courtroom grew deathly quiet. "Mr. David, you have painted a very compelling picture of your suffering today." The prosecutor began, his voice echoing loudly. "You claim you had absolutely no knowledge of Derek Wilson's fraudulent activities. You claim your home equity was stolen from you without your consent. Is that your sworn testimony under penalty of perjury?" David sat up straight, projecting righteous indignation. "Yes, I was completely blindsided. They ruined my life." The prosecutor opened the manila folder. He pulled out a stack of decrypted bank statements featuring a massive, undeniable paper trail. "That is fascinating." The prosecutor stated, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy level. "Because the forensic accounting provided by our lead investigator tells a very different story." We have pulled the encrypted routing data from Nexus Tech's offshore Cayman accounts. According to these authenticated wire transfers, your home equity was not stolen. It was voluntarily transferred. And more importantly, 72 hours after that transfer, cleared a Cayman shell company deposited exactly $30,000 into a private hidden account registered under your name. David's face instantly drained of all color. His jaw went slack. The confident posture vanished, replaced by the sheer naked terror of a man stepping on a landmine. That $30,000 represents exactly 10% of the equity you claim was stolen. The prosecutor continued, his voice hammering through the courtroom like a gavel. It was a commission, a kickback. You knowingly allowed Derek Wilson to launder money through your marital assets. You willingly defrauded your own household, and you took a 10% cut to keep your mouth shut and fund your private lifestyle. You are not a victim. You are an unindicted co-conspirator. Objection! The defense attorney shouted, scrambling to his feet. Overruled. The judge barked, leaning over the bench, her eyes glaring holes into David. The witness has opened the door to his own credibility. David stammered, gripping the edges of the witness stand. His eyes darted frantically around the room, finally locking onto me. I sat perfectly still, holding his terrified gaze. I had spent months digging through the digital architecture of Derek's ledger. I had found the hidden routing numbers. I had traced every single penny David thought he had buried. I had let him walk into this courtroom and commit federal perjury just so I could watch him destroy himself on the public record. I did not know where the money came from. David choked out, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic squeak. It was a loan. Derek said it was a corporate loan. You signed the transfer authorizations digitally using a VPN routed through Costa Rica. The prosecutor fired back without missing a beat. You hid the assets in a secondary account your wife had no legal access to. You conspired to strip your own family of their security for a payout. The courtroom erupted into chaotic whispers. William and Catherine stared at David in shock. Even Derek looked surprised by the sheer depth of David's pathetic greed. David sat completely paralyzed on the stand, his mouth opening and closing silently. His entire carefully crafted illusion of the innocent, victimized father had just been violently ripped to shreds in front of a federal judge. The judge slammed her wooden gavel down hard, the sharp crack silencing the room instantly. Her face was a mask of absolute judicial fury. That is enough. The judge declared, her voice radiating absolute authority. She looked down at David with a disgust so profound it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. You come into my courtroom, swear an oath to tell the truth, and attempt to manipulate the federal justice system to position yourself favorably in a pending family court matter. You have actively participated in a massive financial fraud that devastated your own family. David tried to speak, to beg, but the judge raised her hand, silencing him immediately. Based on the irrefutable financial evidence presented by the prosecution today, your testimony is completely stricken from the record. The judge continued, her words falling like heavy stones. I am officially recommending you to the United States Attorney for immediate indictment on charges of perjury, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Furthermore, as a matter of public record and child welfare, a transcript of today's proceedings and the accompanying financial evidence will be expedited directly to the family court judge presiding over your custody case. You are a morally bankrupt, criminally liable individual. You will not retain custody of those children. Your parental rights are effectively terminated as of this moment. Bailiff, remove him from the stand. David's frantic protests were completely ignored. The bailiffs grabbed him by the arms, physically dragging him out of the courtroom as he screamed his lawyer's name. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his pathetic wails. The gallery was dead silent, stunned by the sheer brutality of the trap that had just snapped shut. The federal judge did not waste a single second. She turned her steely gaze back to the primary defendants. Derek, William, and Catherine sat frozen at the defense table. They looked entirely hollowed out, their expensive courtroom attire suddenly looking like cheap costumes. The judge picked up her pen. With a few swift, sharp strokes, she signed the federal asset forfeiture order. The United States government is hereby seizing every single asset connected to the Wilson family and Nexus Tech. The judge announced, her voice echoing through the massive room. Every bank account, Every offshore trust, every real estate holding, and every luxury asset purchased with stolen funds is frozen effectively immediately. You will be stripped of everything you own to pay federal restitution to your victims. The gavel cracked against the sounding block like a gunshot. It was the sound of an empire turning to ash. 6 months later, the federal agents arrived at the Mercer Island estate to finalize the seizure. I parked my car across the street, sitting quietly in the driver's seat to watch the spectacle unfold. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Dozens of agents swarmed the pristine property. They placed heavy federal padlocks on the wrought iron gates. They slapped bright yellow seizure notices on the front doors. I watched as 2 agents physically escorted William and Catherine out of the grand foyer. They were not wearing their designer clothes. The feds had confiscated Catherine's diamond earrings right off her ears. William's luxury watch was gone. They were handed 2 cheap, flimsy suitcases containing a few basic items of clothing the government deemed non-luxury. The valets were gone. The string quartets were gone. The neighbors, the very people Catherine had spent her entire life trying to impress, stood on their manicured lawns watching the eviction with absolute disgust. Catherine tried to cover her face with her bare hands, but there was nowhere to hide. They were bankrupt, disgraced, and entirely ruined. Then the sky opened up. A brutal, freezing Pacific Northwest storm rolled in with a vengeance. The rain did not just fall, it attacked. It poured down in torrential, icy sheets, instantly soaking William and Catherine to the bone. The federal agents locked the gates behind them and drove away in their black SUVs, leaving my parents standing on the cold, wet sidewalk of the exclusive neighborhood they used to rule. I sat in my car, the heater blowing warm air, the leather seats perfectly comfortable. I watched the rain batter them through my windshield. My phone lit up on the dashboard console. An unsaved number was calling. I knew exactly who it was. I tapped the screen to accept the call, putting it on the car's surround sound speakers. Olivia. Catherine's voice crackled through the speakers, trembling violently with cold and unfiltered panic. Olivia, please tell me you are there. Please tell me you can hear me. I am here, Catherine. I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. They took everything. She sobbed, the sound pathetic and broken. The accounts are completely frozen. My credit cards are declining. Derek is locked in a federal holding cell, and they will not even let us post his bail. We are standing out here in the freezing rain. We do not have a car. We do not have a hotel. We have nothing. I watched her through the rain-swept windshield. She was shivering uncontrollably, her soaked hair plastered against her face. William stood beside her, looking like a defeated, broken old man, clutching his cheap suitcase to his chest. Olivia, please. Catherine begged, her voice cracking. Send a car for us. Let us come to your apartment. We can sleep in your guest room or even down in the basement. We just need a roof over our heads until we figure this out. You have to help us. We are blood. You are our daughter. You cannot just let us die out here in the street. I put the car in drive. I slowly pulled out from my parking spot across the street and rolled toward them. The bright LED headlights of my car cut through the heavy rain, illuminating their pathetic, drenched figures. Catherine saw the car approaching. A look of desperate relief washed over her ruined face. She grabbed her suitcase and practically lunged toward the curb, fully expecting me to unlock the doors and save her from the consequences of her own actions. I stopped the car right in front of them. The rain hammered against the roof. I pressed the button, slowly lowering the passenger side window just enough for her to hear me clearly over the storm. Catherine rushed to the window, placing her wet, shivering hands on the door frame. Thank you, Olivia, she gasped, her teeth chattering. Thank you. Unlock the door, we are freezing. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had enabled a criminal who had stolen from her own child, who had participated in a massive fraud just to maintain her social status. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I smiled. A cold, bright, victorious smile. Do you remember my college graduation, Catherine? I asked, my voice cutting through the sound of the pouring rain with lethal precision. She froze, blinking rapidly against the rain, completely confused by the question. What? Olivia, please open the door. Do you remember when I landed at the airport after years of exhausting work completely alone? I continued, my tone hardening into steel. I texted the family group chat asking for a simple ride home. Do you remember what you replied to me? Catherine stared at me, her eyes widening as the memory finally surfaced. Her face drained of whatever color the cold had left behind. You texted me, why did you not plan better? I recited perfectly, staring directly into her terrified eyes. You told me you could not pick me up because you and William were too busy attending Derek's backyard barbecue to care about my graduation. You left me stranded at the terminal, with my luggage feeling completely worthless, because celebrating your golden child eating hot dogs was more important than my entire future. Olivia, that was years ago. We made a mistake. She pleaded, tears mixing with the freezing rain streaming down her cheeks. Please do not do this. I reached for the window control. I am returning that line to you, Catherine. I said, my voice echoing with final absolute authority. Why did you not plan better? I cannot help you. I am busy going to a barbecue. I pressed the button. The tinted window rolled up smoothly, completely sealing off her desperate, hysterical screams. I hit the gas, leaving them standing in the freezing, torrential rain, with nothing but their cheap suitcases and the total, inescapable ruin they had built for themselves. The rearview mirror offered one final fleeting glimpse of William and Catherine, two small drenched figures shrinking into the dark as my taillights swept around the curve of the Mercer Island Road. I did not look back again. The heavy rhythm of the windshield wipers cleared the driving rain, and with every sweep, the suffocating weight of the past 35 years seemed to wash away. I merged onto the interstate, the hum of the engine a steady, comforting soundtrack to my absolute liberation. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin of my car, the air was warm, quiet, and profoundly peaceful. I drove east, leaving the oppressive artificial glitz of the city limits behind. 45 minutes later, the dense pine trees parted, revealing the sprawling, pristine shoreline of Lake Sammamish. I turned down a private, winding gravel driveway that crunched satisfyingly beneath my tires. The trees opened up to reveal a stunning modern cedar and glass lake house. Warm, golden light spilled from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a welcoming glow over the expansive wooden deck and the private dock below. I parked in the driveway and cut the engine, taking a moment to simply look at the property. I had not bought this house with inherited wealth, nor had I leveraged stolen equity to finance it. This sanctuary was paid for entirely in cash, funded directly by the massive whistleblower commission I received from the Securities and Exchange Commission for dismantling Nexus Tech. It was a monument to the truth built on the ashes of their lies. I grabbed my bag and walked up the stone pathway. Before I even reached the front door, it swung open. Mom! My teenage son and my younger daughter rushed out onto the porch, throwing their arms around me in a crushing simultaneous hug. The smell of rain clinging to my coat did not deter them in the slightest. I held them close, burying my face in their hair, overwhelmed by the fierce, protective love that swelled in my chest. The family court judge had reviewed the overwhelming evidence of David's financial crimes, his perjury, and his deep complicity in Derek's fraud. The ruling had been swift and merciless, stripping David of all parental rights and granting me sole, uncontested custody. My children knew the truth now. They had seen the masks fall, they understood the reality of what their father and grandparents had done, and they had chosen me. There were no more lies to navigate, no more toxic manipulations to untangle. We were safe. Come inside, it is freezing out there. My son laughed, pulling me into the bright, bustling foyer. The contrast between this gathering and the miserable, suffocating events Catherine used to host was staggering. There were no hired valets parking luxury cars, no catering staff balancing silver trays of caviar, and absolutely no string quartets playing background music for people who hated each other. Instead, the house was filled with the rich, mouth-watering scent of hickory smoke roasting garlic and genuine, unrestrained laughter. I walked into the open-concept kitchen and found Jasmine standing at the massive granite island, expertly slicing an array of grilled vegetables. She wore a casual, oversized sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking more relaxed and radiant than I had ever seen her. The moment she spotted me, her face lit up with a brilliant, unburdened smile. She set down the knife, wiped her hands on a towel, and pulled me into a warm embrace. "The Wicked Witch of Mercer Island is officially out in the cold," Jasmine whispered, a knowing glint in her eye. "I just left them standing on the sidewalk," I confirmed, pulling back to grab a piece of roasted bell pepper from the cutting board. "I told them I was busy." Jasmine threw her head back and laughed, the sound carrying over the chatter of the room. Our bond had forged in the fires of that toxic family, but it had solidified into something unbreakable in the aftermath. We were no longer just survivors of the Wilson family dynasty. We were business partners. We had pooled our resources, combined her operational brilliance with my forensic accounting expertise, and launched our own financial consulting firm. We answered to no one but ourselves, and business was booming. The house was packed with real friends. Agent Harrison and his husband were chatting by the stone fireplace, holding bottles of local craft beer. The federal forensic accounting team who had helped me trace the offshore routing numbers were gathered around the kitchen island, passionately debating the best dry rubs for ribs. These were people who respected me for my mind, my integrity, and my work ethic. There was no need to perform, no need to shrink myself to make someone else feel larger. I poured myself a glass of rich red wine and leaned against the kitchen counter, letting my gaze wander into the adjacent living room. The space was beautifully decorated, featuring comfortable plush furniture and vibrant artwork that actually meant something to me. But the absolute focal point of the room, positioned perfectly above the custom stone mantel, was not an expensive abstract painting designed to impress wealthy guests. It was my master's degree. I had finally taken the diploma out of the dark cardboard tube where it had been hidden for years. It was now encased in a heavy museum-quality mahogany frame, perfectly illuminated by a dedicated gallery spotlight. For years, Catherine and William had dismissed my education as a useless hobby, a mere piece of paper that paled in comparison to Derek's fraudulent business ventures. They had skipped my graduation to eat hot dogs and drink cheap beer in a backyard, telling me I was socially unfit to matter. Now that exact degree was the foundation of my entire life. It was the weapon I had used to meticulously dismantle their criminal empire, the tool I used to build my own highly successful business, and the proudest symbol of my unyielding independence. Suddenly, I felt a sharp, continuous vibration in the pocket of my jacket. I set my wine glass down and pulled out my phone. The screen was lit up with a highly secure notification from my private wealth management bank. I tapped the screen and opened the application. The digital ledger loaded instantly. A massive multi-million-dollar wire transfer from the United States Treasury had just cleared, depositing my final authorized percentage of the recovered Nexus Tech assets directly into my personal account. The string of zeros was staggering, permanently securing my financial future and my children's futures for generations to come. I stared at the glowing numbers for a long, quiet moment. I thought about the freezing rain tearing across Mercer Island, the pathetic, soaked suitcases resting on the pavement, and the desperate, utterly defeated look on Catherine's face as my window rolled up. Then I looked up at my children laughing with Jasmine across the kitchen, surrounded by people who loved us for exactly who we were. I closed the banking application. I held the power button down and swiped the screen, completely powering off the phone. I tossed the dark, silent device onto the kitchen counter and walked out through the sliding glass doors onto the expansive back deck. The rain had stopped out here, leaving behind a cool evening air rolling off the lake that was crisp and undeniably invigorating. The sky was clearing, revealing a brilliant canvas of stars above the dark water. I picked up a pair of silver tongs, smiled at the brilliant, crackling flames of the barbecue, and tossed a thick, perfectly seasoned cut of meat onto the grill. Absolute, undeniable freedom had never tasted so sweet. The saga of Olivia's confrontation with her deeply manipulative family serves as a masterclass in recognizing and dismantling toxic dynamics. For years, she existed in an environment where affection was entirely conditional, weaponized to keep her compliant, while shielding the favored son, Derek. The most profound lesson hidden within the wreckage of the Wilson family dynasty is that true empowerment never comes from finally earning a toxic family's approval. It comes from realizing you never needed it in the first place. When faced with systemic betrayal from the people supposed to protect her, a mother who belittled her, a father who facilitated fraud, and a husband who actively stole from her, the protagonist did not rely on emotional appeals. Emotional appeals to people devoid of empathy only provide them with more ammunition. Instead, the ultimate liberation was achieved through meticulous preparation, unwavering boundaries, and absolute financial independence. The framing of the master's degree above the mantel is brilliantly symbolic. It represents the very ambition her parents mocked, which ultimately became the exact tool used to orchestrate her survival and their inevitable downfall. This narrative strips away the societal myth that shared DNA automatically equates to unconditional loyalty, proving that familial titles do not excuse abuse, theft, or cruelty. Healing requires stepping out of the assigned scapegoat role, stopping the endless pursuit of validation from a broken system, and investing that energy into one's own growth. The sweetest justice is not simply watching the perpetrators face their ruin, but walking away into a life filled with genuine peace, a supportive chosen family, and undeniable self-sufficiency. If you find yourself endlessly sacrificing your own peace for a family that only drains your worth, take the first step today to build your own safety net and walk away toward your own unshakable freedom.